Okay. We're live, apparently. Okay. Hello, everybody. Testing, testing, 1 2 1 2, as they say. Let's see if the chat says hello back. Just this is always the slightly nervous thing if seeing if all the audio settings are actually working properly. Someone says hello, so they've seen us. That's good.
That's good. It's a start.
Right, I think it sounds like they're. Yeah, it sounds like they can hear us. That's good. Okay, right. So, welcome back, everybody. Someone's saying the stream seems higher quality than previous. Well, that's weird because the previous streams I've done have been broadcast straight from my camera. This one is coming to you via Zoom, so my camera is going through Zoom and then to everyone else. So I don't know why passing it through an additional bit of software makes it better, but so be it. And yeah, so today we obviously have the return of the great John Parshall, one half of the author team behind Shattered Sword, and several upcoming works, which may or may not be mentioned a bit later, depending on preference. So we're obviously going to be learning a bit more about the Battle of Midway, but hang on, this thing has an echo. That's going to be annoying. That may be me, to be honest. I may have to switch to headphones. Let's see if I do that. Right. So if this is working, then if you say something.
Test 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Right, cool. I can hear you. So,
okay.
And hopefully everyone else. Yeah.
The status on the echo.
Let's have a look. No echo on their end now, so that's good. Right.
Excellent. All right.
Okay.
Plus, you look strangely attractive in headphones. I mean, so.
Yeah. Well, the more of me that is concealed. Yeah, guys, I think the reason for the echo was I had everything on speakers. So I think what was happening is John was saying something. It was coming through my speakers, which was then coming into my microphone, which was then coming back to you as an echo, and so on. So now I've got headphones on. Hopefully that won't happen. Right. Anyway, so before we start on the Midway in full with everyone asking questions and so on and so forth, and we do have a few pre-selected questions that I'll use as well. First, we're going to get a little presentation which has not reached the wider world yet. John was just telling me before we started that this has been presented to a very small audience previously, but the article that it's supposed to be in is coming out very soon now, ostensibly.
Yeah. It should be out within a matter of days from the U.S. Naval War College Review. And it looks at the role of point luck in the battle planning around the Battle of Midway. So I'm looking forward to showing that off. And shall we just go?
Yep, let's go. It's your show.
All right. All righty. So hopefully everybody can see that. So yeah, we are here. Of course, this is the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Midway, and wanted to definitely commemorate that. But also, just sort of in keeping with the previous broadcast, I did want to share another historical cocktail with our audience before we kick things off and get into the presentation. And then the majority of the time will actually be Q&A, just like we did last time. So the cocktail that I want to highlight today is the Suffering Bastard, which is actually an invention from the Middle East. If we look at the year 1942, at that point in time, this gentleman, Joe Shalom, was arguably the most famous bartender in the world. He was an Egyptian Jew of Italian and Russian descent. He was supposed to be a chemist. That's what his parents wanted him to do. And he had training in chemistry, but he decided he didn't want to do that. He wanted to be a bartender. And he ended up being the man behind the bar at Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo, which was the fanciest hotel in all of Cairo. And of course, during 41, 42, this was the epicenter of Britain's war effort in the Mideast. And the problem for Joe was that they were starting to run out of the good stuff. You couldn't get imported cognac anymore. So he was being asked by the troops to come up with something that would cure a hangover, but that was still, mixable with the ingredients that he had to hand. And so he came up with a cocktail called the Suffering Bastard, which is this little gem here. An ounce of brandy or bourbon. I'm going with bourbon at this point, being an American as I am. An ounce of gin, an ounce of lime juice, a little bit of Angostura bitters. You shake it, put it in a glass, and then you top it off with ginger beer. The mint is not growing yet in Minnesota at this time of the year, but I do have my orange slice.
Nice.
Tasty, good stuff. And so, without further ado, let's talk about point luck in the battle planning around Battle of Midway, which I don't think that this topic has been properly appreciated, honestly, probably since about 1942. It's never been talked about correctly in any of the prior histories of the battle. And so I'm really sort of excited to talk about, what led me down this road. Let's see here if I can let's go full screen. Much better. There we are. So I want to talk about, where did this article come from? What were its origins? I want to look at the battle planning. I want to talk about point luck. And then actually, despite my reputation as being violently opposed to counterfactual scenarios, I want to look into a couple of counterfactuals that are also part of this article that were generated using techniques that I think are relatively unique to the field of history and were kind of interesting to explore as well. So back in 2004, when Tony and I were putting the finishing touches on Shattered Sword, we wrote in our conclusion in that book, when we were talking about the odds that Nimitz actually faced during the battle, that we took the view that Nimitz had a finer appreciation of those odds than a lot of the authors that were writing about that battle 60 years hence, and that based on estimates of 4 to 5 Japanese carriers, Nimitz was within his rights to think that he, if he put his forces in the right place, they could carry the day. The thing I didn't know then, which only came out a couple of years later when John Lundstrom came out with his book, Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, he and I were having a conversation, and he said, John, Nimitz was willing to fight Nimitz even if Yorktown couldn't be there. And I started to think about that, and you can see it, here in black and white in the operational plan that Nimitz issued on May 27th, that if Yorktown is not available, instructions will be issued as the employment of the remainder of the force. In other words, we're still going up here, guys, Yorktown or no Yorktown. Well, the more I started thinking about this back in 2019, 2020, 3 U.S. carriers versus 5 Japanese. If Zuikaku comes along to the party, that feels a little bit dicey. If it were only 2 carriers potentially against 5, that started verging on feeling a little bit crazy, really, and what on earth was Nimitz really thinking about being willing to accept those odds? And what might have happened if a battle had occurred under those conditions of either 3 against 5 or worst case 2 against 5. And so that was the sort of the genesis for this paper. One of the things we have to do at this point is, in order to come up with valid conclusions about the battle planning, we need to put ourselves into Nimitz's perceptual frame. What did he believe? What did he think he knew at that point in time? And also what was going on in the larger world around him. And it's important to recognize that at this point, Chester Nimitz is living in a pressure cooker. The war situation is absolutely wretched. Things are going terribly for the Russians on the Eastern Front. Things are absolutely, the fat is in the fire in the Middle East as well. Malta is being bombed into ruin. The Germans are about to kick off the Battle of Gazala, which is going to end up with the capture of Tobruk. So the war situation is a nightmare. Meanwhile, Nimitz has got this boss back in D.C., Admiral Ernest J. King, who was never the easiest guy to work with, even under good circumstances. And King himself is living in a real pressure cooker because at this very moment, German U-boats are turning the east coast of the U.S. into a shooting gallery. And King is getting pressure from his counterpart, General Marshall. FDR chews him out in June and says, you've got to turn this situation around. So King is not in a very good mood either. And funniest thing, pressure tends to roll downhill to one's subordinates. And at this point in time, Nimitz and King really don't have a very trusting relationship. King feels that Nimitz is too timid. And it took some real doing on Nimitz's part to even get King to give him the permission to go fight the Battle of Coral Sea in early May of 1942. So this is not a happy relationship at this point in time, and Nimitz expects, or King rather, expects Nimitz to be producing results and quickly to turn around this train wreck. The situation we find ourselves in the Pacific in terms of the overall carrier balance right prior to Midway. Lexington has been lost at the Battle of Coral Sea. Saratoga is in the yards because she has a nasty tendency to run across enemy submarines and collect torpedoes. Shokaku has been damaged very badly at Coral Sea and is out of the picture. Zuikaku had her air group shot to pieces in that same battle, and it's an open question as to whether or not she's going to be able to get a composite air group and come along. But you can see that the situation in the Pacific right now is really pretty bad for the Americans, because Yorktown likewise has been damaged at Coral Sea. So May 14th, Hypo, which is the code-breaking station in Hawaii, gets the first clue that the Japanese are planning an attack aimed at Midway. And within a couple of days, Nimitz is on board with that estimate. And a couple of days after that, King as well is on board with that estimate. 26 May, Enterprise and Hornet get back to Pearl Harbor. The day after, Yorktown limps in as well. And that night, Nimitz briefs his commanders on his battle plan. So the two wild cards here that have to be managed are, one, do we think that Yorktown is going to be patched up in time to make this battle? And two, do we think that Zuikaku is going to be along for the party? And there's a real disfunct between the intelligence estimates that are coming out of Hawaii and the intelligence estimates that are coming out of Washington, D.C., Op 20G, which is actually sort of the boss station over Hypo. And Nimitz lays that out explicitly in his estimate of the situation that he issues the day before his battle plan. You can see right here out of the original document, Cominch, which is Admiral King, is saying that it's going to be carrier divisions 1 and 2 plus one more carrier, Zuikaku, for a total of 5. Whereas SyncPack, Nimitz, is saying there's going to be 4 CVs on the basis of what Hypo is telling him. So other things that Nimitz thinks he knows. He thinks that the Japanese are likely to operate in 2 task forces. That's sort of a case of mirror imaging, but that's what Intel is telling him is going to happen, that there may be one task group that's going to close on Midway, deliver the attacks against the island, and a second task group may be lurking out there someplace and supporting the first task force. He knows he's going to have an air group on Midway of approximately 90 aircraft. He should have about a dozen fleet submarines in position as well. And he believes that these assets are absolutely crucial to sort of attrite the incoming Japanese carrier force before he decides to commit his own carrier force. He's going to have to whittle them down a little bit first before he's going to be willing to risk his own carriers. One of the things that both Nimitz and King are inveighing against during this entire time is that they do not want to be in a situation where they're simply swapping losses 1 for 1. The sting of losing Lexington at Coral Sea for what was seen as the negligible gain of having sunk Shoho, a light carrier, is really bugging Nimitz and King both. And Nimitz explicitly says, at the present stage of the war, we cannot afford to swap losses with this ratio. And King likewise comes back and says, we've got to be husbanding our carrier strength if at all possible at this point in the war. The other things Nimitz thinks he knows is, according to current U.S. dive bomber doctrine, one squadron of 18 dive bombers should be sufficient to knock out an enemy carrier. The bottom line is that we think the accuracy of those dive bombers is going to be 1 bomb in 6 will hit, and we think that 3 bombs will be sufficient to put a carrier out of action. So you do the math, 18 planes ought to be able to get rid of 1 enemy carrier. And that means that, theoretically speaking, if I'm carrying 2 squadrons of dive bombers per carrier, each one of those carriers should be able to knock out 2 enemy flight decks if they can get that first blow in. So that's, kind of the doctrinal mathematics that Nimitz is working with here. So let's take a look at his battle plan that comes out on May 27th, just after Yorktown ties up at dock. This is a screen cap of the original battle plan itself, laying out the submarine patrol sectors off of Midway. It's anticipated that Kido Butai is going to be coming in from the northwest of the island and should materialize, 175, 200 miles away before making its way closer to launched attacks. The American carriers are going to be positioned in this place called Point Luck, which is off to the northeast of the island of Midway. And they're gonna stay there. Basically, what's going to happen is we're going to flood the incoming vector with as many submarines as we can get. We're going to use our ground-based air assets at Midway to whittle down that force. And then, and only then, when we think that we have sufficiently attrited the Japanese force, will we move our carriers into position and take a whack at the Japanese. The thing that's not been properly appreciated during the past 85 years is just how far away Point Luck is from the incoming Japanese. It's going to be about 360 nautical miles from where the Japanese are supposed to show up. And what does that mean? Well, it means that our aircraft are nowhere near in range to attack the Japanese. If you look at the range of both the Wildcat and the TBD Devastator, it's 175 nautical miles. The SBDs can reach out a little bit further to 225, but you can see that in order to get within strike position, we're going to have to, move our carriers a long distance in order to get within range, about 185 nautical miles. Even if we cut the corner and go on the assumption that the Japanese will close the island so we can, use the hypotenuse to our advantage, we're still going to have to get, 150 nautical miles closer before we can launch that strike. Well, the implication to come out of that are, kind of interesting. It's going to take us at least 6 to 8 hours of hard steaming to get within launch distance. And depending on when we get actionable intelligence on that morning, the earliest we'd be able to be in a position to launch would be mid-afternoon, and it's not inconceivable that it might be late afternoon, in which case we'd be butting up against a potential night landing as well. And there's no way that somebody like Fletcher is going to want to do that, or Nimitz either. So really, this initial placement of Point Luck means that it is highly likely that this battle is a multi-day affair, not a single-day affair, as the real historical battle turned out to be. So what I think is going on here is that Point Luck really is a risk management tool. It gives the on-site carrier commanders the option to assess the situation and make a go, no-go decision based on how the ground-based air assets and the submarines are doing their job. And if it looks like we're not doing so hot, it gives Fletcher the opportunity to disengage his carrier force and just get the heck out of Dodge before he even comes within sighting range of the Japanese. So, and this is congruent with the things that Nimitz is telling those carrier commanders. He's being very explicit in saying, I do not want you to get into a slugfest. If things are going badly, get out of there and let the Marines do their thing. That's why we put them there. They can defend the island. And this is congruent with the instructions that Nimitz ends up issuing to his carrier task force commanders, that this battle has to be fought along the concept of calculated risk, that we have to avoid the exposure of our forces unless we think that we can do disproportionate damage to the enemy. Do not get into a slugfest again. That's the overriding message here. And yet we end up with the battle that we ended up with, right? So how did that come about? We managed by hook or by crook to patch up Yorktown within about 48 hours. And on 30 May, she sails. The other two carriers have already left before her. 31 May, Hypo definitively determines that Zuikaku is not going to come to the party. They detect the fact that some of her aviators have been detached from her air group and are being assigned to other carriers, some of which are going up to the Aleutians. So there's no way that she can be there because she's not going to have a full air group. And then on 2 June, Yorktown actually arrives at Point Luck with the other two carriers. And very shortly thereafter, that afternoon, Nimitz issues another instruction, or a suggestion, as he puts it here. This is out of the Gray Book, the Running Intelligence Estimate of the Pacific Fleet. It was suggested to Task Force 16 and 17 that a position further to the west might be advantageous. Well, Fletcher is nobody's fool, and he understands that suggestions from four-star admirals do carry a lot of gravitas. And he duly moves both of his carrier task forces that night 175 nautical miles further west to a point much closer to the north of Midway rather than being off to the northeast. So now he's within about 185 nautical miles of where Kitabutai is supposed to show up. And that is what leads to the sort of the classical form of the battle that was actually fought, where it's compressed into a single day engagement. And again, from an interpretive standpoint, I think what's going on here is, by the time Yorktown actually shows up at Point Luck, he now knows he's got 3 carriers on site. He is certain that Zuikaku is not coming along, so it's going to be 3 on 4. And so Nimitz now is willing to dial up the risk knob a little bit and compress his battle plan into a single day engagement so he can get his carriers in there and hit them as quickly as possible. And what that demonstrates, obviously, is that Nimitz is both a flexible commander and a very aggressive commander as well. During the actual battle, of course, some of the underlying tenets of Nimitz's battle plan fall apart. Midway's air group does nothing to Kitabutai. The submarines likewise perform very poorly. And then Hornet likewise performs very poorly during the battle, during the infamous flight to nowhere, which, essentially wastes her air group to no effect whatsoever. But the bottom line is that Enterprise and Yorktown, between them, have got enough organic firepower to get the job done. So now I want to talk about some of the counterfactuals. What might have happened if the battle had been 3 versus 5, i.e. if Zuikaku would come along? What might have happened if it had been 2 versus 5 and Yorktown had not been able to be along for the ride? And to do that, what I want to do is I want to use this article, which was published a couple of years ago by a pair of Spanish economists, actually, who also have an interest in military history and like building stochastic mathematical models. And Jose is a really interesting guy. And I actually, by way of disclosure, I helped him prepare this stochastic model for their article. And then he and I worked together to answer some of the questions that I brought up later on. So, quick 30-second nutshell description of what stochastic modeling is. We're building a mathematical model here based on what actually historically happened during the battle. And so they're doing things like modeling, what are the probabilities of aircraft finding their targets, hitting their targets, what's the damage that gets done to the targets, will they be shot down, will they be intercepted, how good is the anti-aircraft? All of those variables are put into the model. And then you tune the model against historical results to, kind of get it tuned up so you can play with it to then look at counterfactual situations. So the other variable that Bonkers and Torres modeled was whether or not Hornet performs according to her historical norm, or whether good Hornet shows up. And Mitcher, actually follows his orders and sends his air groups to search in the same direction that Yorktown and Enterprise's air groups do. So that's another switch we can use in this model is to turn that on and off. So looking at their model in the historic 4 versus 3 encounter, what they anticipate will happen, the historical battle ends up with 4 sunk Japanese carriers and a sunk American carrier, the Yorktown. Their model, when tuned, replicates that pretty closely. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, an American carrier sunk, and another one damaged. So that's basically how the tuning exercise goes. But that's with Bad Hornet, right? Because historically, Bad Hornet was Bad Hornet. But if you run that same model with Good Hornet, lo and behold, the anticipated results would be 4 Japanese carriers sunk, 4 no American carriers sunk whatsoever. So what does that imply? Well, it backs up the thing that Tony and I have been saying for the last 15 years, which was Midway was not an incredible victory. And this is a really important insight from Bonkers and Torres. We have shown that Midway was a battle the Japanese probably could never win, and that the final result was conditioned by the timing imposed by the earlier attack on the Midway airbase. In other words, by launching that initial morning attack, Nagumo wrong foots himself from the very beginning and puts himself behind the power curve, if you will. That given the number of American scouting assets that were there, it should have been very likely that the Americans would find the Japanese first, attack them effectively first, and that's exactly what ended up happening. The second implication, frankly, is that Mark Mitcher sank the Yorktown. Okay, I'm just going to come right out there and say it. If Mitcher had followed his orders, it is likely that Hornet's entire air group should have attacked at the same time the torpedo plane squadron attacked at around 0920. By rights, they should have knocked 1 or 2 of those Japanese carriers out right then and there, leaving Yorktown and Enterprise to clean up the mess within the next hour. If there's no Kita Butai, there's no counterstrike against Yorktown, the Americans win this thing 4-0 by lunchtime. So by disobeying his orders, I think you can make a pretty strong argument that Mark Mitcher is directly culpable for the loss of the Yorktown. Now let's look at 5 versus 3. If we look with Bad Hornet in the mix, Bonkers and Torres anticipate that the battle ends up with 3, maybe 4 Japanese carriers sunk and 2 American carriers sunk. If Good Hornet ends up doing her thing, the Japanese lose all 5 of their carriers and the Americans lose 1, maybe 1.5, something like that. So that's kind of interesting too, in that the common wisdom has always been that, oh my God, if Zuikaku comes to the battle, it's game over for Nimitz. And that's not what this model suggests. It says that even with Zuikaku there, the advantages of being able to strike effectively first outweigh that additional carrier, and that Nagumo is going to take very heavy losses no matter what ends up happening. On the other hand, of course, the Americans are likely to lose 2 carriers, but if they could sink 4 or 5 in return, that's an exchange rate that I'm sure that Nimitz and King both would have accepted. Now, though, if you get into 5 versus 2, things go kind of pear-shaped. If Bad Hornet shows up, the Americans lose both of their carriers. And in fact, it's much more lopsided than that. The model suggests that the Americans suffer around 4 firepower kills. I mean, they get blown out of the water is what happens. And the Japanese lose 2. And this is, that even swap scenario that both Nimitz and King do not want to have happen. So this is not a good outcome at all. Even with Good Hornet, it doesn't do that much to rectify things. Maybe there's damage to an additional Japanese carrier, but the bottom line is that the Americans lose both of their flight decks. Not good. So 5 versus 2 really is a carrier too far, to sort of paraphrase our movies. And the problem there is that Nimitz really didn't understand, how badly his other assets were lacking. That, things like B-17s are just not very good at hitting maneuvering warships, and that the current doctrine and, frankly, the current levels of captaincy of a lot of his submarines left a very great deal to be desired. Things like that. So really what it points out is just how important it was to have Yorktown in the historical battle, that she represents the margin of error, a little extra padding in the firepower that is crucial to assuring that the Americans actually do get the win in this particular fight. And so with that, I will end. Thank you very much. That was fun.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Actually, it's a little bit of an extra perspective on Midway that I hadn't considered before, and yeah, the wonderful element of that modelling that basically kicks out almost every possible realistic combination of Midway scenarios
Yeah,
that could be done. I'm sure someone in the chat will ask what if Saratoga had shown up, but you know what?
absolutely. Right, right. Yeah,
um,
no, and I do think that their Bongers and Torres statement that it was the actual launching of the attack against Midway at 0430 that in essence decides the battle. I mean, that's something that I've never seen in any other historical work, and I think it's intriguing that it was a conclusion that was come to by a pair of economists on the basis of tools that we don't normally throw at these sort of hysterical or historical scenarios. Anyway, for what
yeah,
that's worth, hysterical.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. To be honest, some of these scenarios do get a little bit hysterical depending on what we're modelling.
Right.
I can't wait to see what would happen if we turn them loose on the various Bismarck scenarios. I think the internet will melt.
Yeah, right. The ship that must not be named.
Yes, yeah. KMS Voldemort.
Yeah.
Oh
What do you
dear.
got? What do you got in the way of questions?
Right, so we have a few super chats and a few selected highly voted ones from Patreon to start with, and then we'll move into random grab bag of the live stream chats.
Sounds
So
good.
we have one. Do you have any interest in the Battle of Santa Cruz? And what were some important lessons from Midway that shaped that battle versus what lessons did the Japanese Navy actually learn?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Santa Cruz, of course, being the fourth of the carrier battles fought in the year 1942. I certainly do address it in my 42 tome.
Hmm.
Um, what I think is interesting about Santa Cruz is that you do see that the Japanese are adapting their doctrine with things like they put a vanguard force out in front of their carrier groups, um, both to allow some of their organic scouting assets, the float planes that are on some of those cruisers, to be used for scouting purposes, and also, frankly, to act as an air power sump and soak up some of the attacks that might be aimed at the Japanese carrier groups. They're sort of betting on the fact that, if there's an American air group flying overhead and they see some juicy battleships down here, maybe they'll get a little trigger happy and go after the battleships and, blow off their original mission and not go after our carriers. You see as well that the Japanese are maneuvering their carrier task forces now in separate task forces. They're trying to do a little separation as a passive damage control element. They also are integrating lighter flight decks like Zuiho in hopes of augmenting their cap. In fact, Zuiho's job is to be pretty much just a cap vessel in the original battle plan. So, fast forward to then, what you're seeing is that the Japanese really are trying to learn some of the lessons from Midway. Another important one is uh, we do all of our arming and refueling on the flight decks now, not down in the hangars, because, we learned that lesson in a very painful fashion. And in fact, that emphasis on topside arming and refueling operations is something that's going to carry forward all the way into the Battle of Philippine Sea, for instance. That is now standard Japanese operating doctrine. The tragedy, of course, for the Japanese carrier force during that battle is that their air groups just get shot to pieces, and I'm forgetting the exact number of fatalities now. I think it's 142 Japanese carrier aviators are killed during that battle, which is more than the 110 that are killed during the Battle of Midway. And, at the end of Coral Sea, then Midway, then Eastern Solomons, and finally Santa Cruz, by the time the smoke clears over that fourth and final battle, you can really take a hard look at the pilot corps in the Japanese carrier force and say these guys have lost their edge. The new guys that are coming in the ranks just do not have the same quality that the old guys had. And from now on, they're in this vicious downward spiral of new guys without sufficient training going up in the air, tangling with Americans who are more combat experienced and shortly will have a better fighter as well. And they could just never get out of that cycle.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things. I mean, when I was looking into Santa Cruz from the Guadalcanal series that I did, I think once I'd added up aircraft that came back to the Japanese, and then minus the aircraft that they immediately wrote off as basically flying civs.
Right.
They started out the battle with multiple flight decks loaded with aircraft, and by the end of the battle, they didn't actually have enough aircraft to fully man a single one of the Shogakus,
Yeah.
which is
Right.
pretty awful.
Stunning. Yeah. Stunning. One of the other episodes out of that, I think I got this out of Lundstrom's book. I always give Junyo grief as being a scow. I just converted carriers, and Tony and I go back and forth on this all the time because Tony loves Junyo and Hiyo. He's just got a real soft spot for him, and I'm just like, they're garbage, they're hot trash. But give Junyo her due. She puts in the final attacks that day that the Duin Hornet. And yet there was an account when her pilots came back and landed on the ship, and they have now been up against new American anti-aircraft firepower, particularly in the form of the South Dakota and a couple of these Atlanta-class light cruisers, who were just bristling with 5-inch guns, and also now with the 40-millimeter Bofors. When some of those pilots climbed out of the cockpit, they were so shell-shocked they couldn't talk. Okay, and that's the magnitude of firepower that they were looking at the end of 1942, and it's only going to get worse from there. So it really does give you a glimpse into just how the defensive characteristics in carrier warfare were beginning to take over, and it wasn't just fighter direction. It really was physical gun power on American vessels was just becoming an unholy terror. By the time you get to that battle.
Yeah, I must admit, I think everyone watching that series loved the I was constantly updating whenever it was possible with the battle reports written by officers of USS Enterprise. And it's hilarious how it starts out. There's whoever's the one particular officer who's writing recommendations. He starts out with, "Can we have more Orlikans, please?" And then, "Can we have even more Orlikans, please?"
More
and then the final stage of it gets to, okay, we've now covered every available inch with Orlikans. However, I have a cunning plan. What if we take off the belt armor? Will that free up more displacement so we can stick on even more Orlikans?
Yeah.
Which I don't think actually went anywhere.
No,
but
that never happened. But yeah, you can kind of see. Again, there's this sort of American tendency. It's just like, well, more of everything is, is working quite nicely for us. Let's keep doing that.
So we've now got the next question was, how much importance did Nimitz place on the land-based aircraft at Midway? Did he actually think they could knock out any of the Japanese carriers?
It's real interesting. In the course of this article, I had to go back through the Gray Book and try to get a sense for, what did Nimitz really think about these air assets? Because if you look at the air group that's going to be sitting on Midway, it's this incredibly bizarre polyglot force. You've got B-17s, you've got these a couple of squadrons of dive bombers, one of which is, ancient. We've got Buffalo fighters, we've got Wildcat fighters, we've got 6 new TBF Avengers, we got a quartet of American or Army Air Force B-26s that we're kind of slapping torpedoes on and hoping they're going to do something. It's pretty clear that by the time we get to Midway, Nimitz is already getting inklings that B-17s at least are not getting it done. There's a section out of the Gray Book which is talking about some of the claims that the Army Air Force bombers were making during Coral Sea, and the Navy is already like, nah, I don't think so, So I do think that Nimitz had to have been fairly cautious about how he viewed the potency of those assets. But on the other hand, he's got 90 some aircraft there. And he's got a hell of a lot of scouting assets too in the form of PBY Catalinas. So I'll kill that phone call. I think the bottom line is that for Nimitz, if I've got a lot of aircraft, something's got to shake out my way, right? I would think that with 90 aircraft, I should be able to damage or destroy one Japanese carrier, shouldn't I? That, I think, is kind of how he went into the battle. And unfortunately, that did not turn out to be the case.
The chieftain asks a basic question. Are the grey books you're referencing the Navy version of Army Green books?
Well, okay, so that's interesting, actually. If you look at the historiography of the battle, and actually I just published an article on this in Naval History magazine, Naval Institute Press's magazine. It came out last month, and it's free online. They didn't paywall it. The equivalent of the Army's Green Meanies are, of course, Samuel Eliot Morrison's multi-volume set, which are not nearly as voluminous as the Army histories. I don't use Morrison very much anymore, I'll be honest with you. He's a tremendous writer. He's got a great narrative sense, but in terms of the operational details, I mean, you'd be a fool to accept his aircraft totals, for instance, as gospel. And of course, he was writing before the fact that we had decoded the Japanese codes that knowledge had been promulgated to the public. That doesn't happen until the late 1960s, I believe. So Morrison is hampered in that respect, and that he can't give you the full meal deal because he didn't know all the details himself. There's, I think, a broader problem with Morrison in that trying to task one human being with writing the entire official history of the U.S. Navy, the biggest Navy in world history, in this gigantic conflict, and also cranking those puppies out, just a few years after the conflict, that's just beyond human capability to achieve. It should have been approached in the way that the Army approached their histories, by having multidisciplinary teams, in many cases co-authored volumes, and just throwing a lot more human power at those histories. So yeah, that's where I'm at with Morrison.
Fair enough. Next question we have is, how well did the escorts do in the battle? Do you know if they accounted for any aircraft shot down, and did any of them have radar which played a major role?
Wow. That is a really good question. I don't know the details of that, to be honest with you. I tend to look more at the Japanese side than the American side, and I presume we're talking about the American side here. The escorts that get involved during the fight, of course, are strictly those of Task Force 17, i.e. the group that is around Yorktown. Yorktown has a CXAM radar. I do not know the details. I would suspect that some of the cruisers might have as well. If you do look at the typical anti-aircraft outfit of an American destroyer, for instance, during the middle of 1942, it is nothing to write home about. Now, the 5-inch 38 is the finest heavy anti-aircraft gun of the war, I would argue, hands down. And I believe that has been also argued on this channel as well.
Yes, I've proved it mathematically.
Mathematically, thank you. So, that's a great piece, and each one of those American destroyers is packing 4 or 5 of those things. But if you look at the automatic firepower on those ships, it's negligible at this point in time. It may be a quartet of 50 caliber machine guns, and that's pretty much it. So I am not aware right off the top of my head whether or not any of the escorts shot down any of the Japanese planes. We do know that flak accounted for some of them, but my sense is that it was Yorktown's flak that took down some of the dive bombers that were attacking her. as an interesting what if, it would have been fascinating to see what would have happened if the Japanese had ever attacked Task Force 16, because of course one of the ships in its screen
Hmm.
was the brand new light cruiser Atlanta, which packs 16 5-inch 38s, and that's a lot of boom boom.
Yes.
You know, that could have been a very effective asset, and it's unfortunate because if you look at the allocation of anti-aircraft firepower between the two task forces, Task Force 17 really could have used another cruiser.
Yeah. So the next one we've got is are there any mysteries that you hope get uncovered whenever the remaining wrecks of Midway are found? I mean, obviously we found a Kargi and Karga, and if there aren't any mysteries you think can be solved by looking at the wrecks, how good are the conditions of the carrier wrecks found so far?
Yeah, good question. I think that, just having a physical knowledge of where those ships sank in relation to each other will end up giving us the ability to sort of wind the tape backwards and have a better understanding of what the formation of those ships was at the time of the attack.
Hmm.
Soryu, in particular, I think would be a fascinating discovery because she essentially marks the location of the battlefield itself, because as soon as she was hit, her engines were off, like like a blade had been stuck through her heart. So if we can understand what the drift conditions would be during that day, and then know where Soryu actually sank, it would be trivial to be able to then dial back and say, this is where the actual attacks occurred. And then potentially even go looking for things like aircraft on the bottom. There might be some of the American aircraft might be there. We lost a dive bomber during the attack on Kaga, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
that might be there. Um, in terms of the quality of the wrecks, so we've only actually filmed Kaga at this point, and she was a mess.
Shockingly.
Shockingly, yeah. And given the account that had been given to us by Yoshino Haruo, who was one of her torpedo plane pilots, I've seen the hand drawn picture that he drew for Chuck Haberline at the Naval History Center, which I then adapted as an illustration in our book. And she burned to the waterline. I mean, it was just horrific. Her entire superstructure, her hangar decks have been caved in all the way down to the belt armor. And that's broadly what we saw on the bottom. There's nothing above her main deck level left intact. We have a top view of a sonar image of a ship that I'm absolutely certain is a Kagi. And the indications are that she too has lost her flight deck. I would be stunned if Soryu's in very good condition, because she just got the bejesus knocked out of her and burned and burned and burned. I think all these carriers, frankly, are going to be a bit of a mess, and 80 years on the bottom won't have done them any favors.
Yeah, I think especially a Kargi, because obviously Soryu at least has the grace of being a purpose-built carrier. A Kargi
Right.
with everything just kind of slapped on top of a battle cruiser hull. If it hadn't already burned away by the time she sank, the impact of hitting the bottom would almost certainly have collapsed whatever was left.
I think that's probably right.
Yeah.
Well, and frankly, the construction standards on their ships were nowhere near as robust as the Americans were. I mean, these were ships that had relatively high superstructures, and they were doing everything they could to save weight. So if you look at like the supports, for instance, for the sponsons for the 5-inch guns on those carriers, in many cases they'll actually have holes cut out of them as weight saving mechanisms. So that says to me that these things were relatively flimsy. And given the fact that we know that the majority of Kaga's superstructure was demolished in the course of those fires, that never happened, frankly, to an American carrier. Even someone like, the Franklin, which had an enormous fire and a fuel air explosion aboard her. There were no substantial chunks just blown out of the side of her hull.
No.
I mean, her flight deck was a disaster, but you get the point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose it's one of those things. It's like when the Midway carriers are examined, you really, really, really hope they've landed keel side down because all the damage is from bombs, and on most of the other
Yeah,
ships, including of course the Voldemort. You kind of wish it would have been really nice if it landed upside down because then we could have seen what happened underwater. But
right, right.
no one's interested in what happened to the top side as
Yeah,
much.
right.
So the next question we've got is do you think that Hornet's participation in the Doolittle raid impeded the combat readiness of its air group due to lack of flying opportunities with all the B-25s on the deck and it being a relatively new ship?
That's a really great question. I think you'd have to say probably. You know, she is very much the least experienced carrier at the battle, as opposed to Yorktown, which was
Mm.
much the most experienced. And so, yeah, I do think that that probably could have had an impact on her training and readiness level. Although, again, I think the real material sin here is Mitcher's
Mm.
decision to use his air group in the way that he decided to use it without consulting his superior officer and then gun decking his
Mm.
reports afterwards. So,
Yeah. The next question, the person who asks it says, I understand Yorktown's air group was augmented by planes and crews from Saratoga. If Saratoga had somehow made it in time for the battle, would Yorktown have enough of her own air group left to be combat effective?
great question. Next question, please. No, I that's a really good question. I mean, Yorktown's air group had been beaten up during Coral Sea, obviously, and that's why they decided to swap out some of her squadrons with those of Saratoga, which were fresher. You'd really have to do some hard digging on, what were the organic aircraft available in Pearl Harbor? What was the personnel situation? I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head.
Hmm.
Um, I will say that one of the things that this points to, though, is the superior organizational quality of the U.S. Navy to be able to treat these squadrons as cookie cutter, implements which we can take off this flight deck and put on that one willy nilly. That flexibility was crucial in being able to get Yorktown back up into the battle in time. And by the same token, that lack of flexibility is the reason that Zuikaku was not there when she could well have been.
Hmm. A couple of people asking what gun decking a report means.
It means lying.
Yeah.
it means skirting around issues that we really don't want to
Hmm.
talk about. And so, Spruance says after the battle, in his own report on the battle, that if it comes down to making a call, if you've got questions about the factual validity of the Enterprise report versus the Hornet report, take the Enterprise report. What does that say?
Hmm.
Okay, Spruance knew. Spruance knew that Mitcher was fibbing. And if you really want to read the best account on this, Craig Simon's book Midway, he really digs into the flight to nowhere. He's a real
Hmm.
expert on that, and I would highly recommend going in and digging into that. And I'll go ahead and pitch here because he is my
Mm-hmm.
friend. He does have a brand new book on
Mm-hmm.
Nimitz that has just come out in the last month or so. I will say, too, I just did a panel discussion with Craig
Mm-hmm.
and also with our mutual friend Trent Hone.
Yep.
Trent Hone likewise has a new Nimitz book coming out from Naval
Hmm.
Institute Press. It'll be hitting the stands in September, and it'll be good, too. So,
Yeah, it's very good. They sent me a copy for preview review, which I actually need to get my review off to them after I cut it down into not 17 pages of.
right, right. Yeah, I mean, Simons is has been publishing books on naval history since time immemorial. He's a great historian. He's got a really good feel for Nimitz as a human being, and also the recipe for the sink pack is in
Mm-hmm.
Craig's book as well. So great book. Trent comes at it from a slightly different perspective in that Trent, like myself, is a technologist and is extremely interested in examining how organizations become learning organizations, and how did Nimitz personally prepare himself for command and then create a staff organization around himself, which was a learning organization to prosecute the Pacific War. So they're different books. They're both really, really good, and they both have different things to contribute to the study of the war.
Awesome. So our next question says, during Hiryu's counterattack, why didn't Yamaguchi launch a combined dive and torpedo bomber strike to split anti-aircraft and combat air patrol fighters for a better chance of survival? And would that have sunk Yorktown faster?
Simple answer is he didn't have his torpedo bombers ready to go. Torpedo planes had been landed around 0917. That was all wrapping up. So they've been down in the hangars, for an hour and a half or so. But they were not ready to go at the time that the dive bombers were ready to go. I mean, there are indications, hearkening back to this question that we had previously, what mysteries are still out there? I'd like to broaden that question to talk about not just what can we learn from the state of the wrecks, but are there new things to be learned about Midway in general? And one of them certainly is what exactly was going on down in the hangars. Because if you were to ask me now, if there were things that I would change about Shattered Sword after 15 years worth of additional scholarship, much of it generated by Tony, I would tell you, that I'm still confused about what's going on in the Japanese hangars, and that I think that Dallas Isom's book that came out 2 years after ours was actually closer to the truth in terms of painting a picture of the utter confusion on those hangar decks and just how badly the constant stream of American attacks were screwing up the efforts to do this rearming exercise. It seems likely that Carrier Division 2 was closer to being ready to go than Carrier Division 1. And there are some indications, that Hiryu may actually have begun the spotting process for her dive bombers, even as the 1020 dive bomber attack was going on. That's still kind of, loosey-goosey. Don't know that that's true. But I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah.
The bottom line is that the torpedo planes weren't ready at that time, and they wouldn't be ready for another hour or more at least. Among other things, if you're the sole carrier left at this point and you don't have a lot of airplanes, you need to make sure that you can patch up the ones that you do have. Some of those birds had battle damage, and we need every damn torpedo bomber we can get our hands on. So I'm sure that there was some rapid repair work going on. Tomonaga's bird being one of those that was, inadequately repaired. So that's what's going on there.
Yeah. And then another question asks, have you done any work on how the Japanese fleet long-term would have been affected by Operation C if that had resulted in an actual confrontation?
That's a great question, too. Operation C, the Indian Ocean operation. Honestly, my opinion about that is that the British were tremendously lucky that they did not run across Kitabutai, and they came within a hair's breadth of doing that. I think that Somerville would have absolutely gotten his butt handed to him. I think it would have been a horrific shellacking. The Japanese air groups were absolutely on the top of their game at this point. The British carriers did not carry large air groups. I just can't see them. You want a 2 versus 5 carrier scenario. There you go.
Yeah.
With appreciably smaller air groups on the part of the British, I just think they would have been destroyed. So I don't, would that have inflicted some losses on the Japanese air groups? Yeah, probably, but probably nothing that they couldn't have absorbed. And the net result, I think, if you're a betting man, you have to think that they just would have annihilated British naval power in the Indian Ocean, and that would have been a disaster for the Brits.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that sometimes people don't appreciate is that give people some idea of how lucky it is to spot even a carrier formation at sea. If you take the map of Midway and the Aikido Butai and the American carriers, and then if you use Aikido Butai as your anchor point, and you plot the course that Somerville's force, his two carriers and Warspite took, it slots neatly right between the American and Japanese formations if they're at Midway, because he comes within 100 miles of Carrier Division 2.
Right.
And it's like that's basic. If in a carrier context, that's effectively point blank range.
Yeah.
But neither side actually. Well, to be fair, one of the Albacores does get shot down. But as far as the two admirals are concerned, neither side actually spots each other. Yeah. So the fact that the Americans come across the Japanese at obviously considerably greater range, and then obviously vice versa with Yorktown, it's not necessarily guaranteed that anyone's going to see anybody in these engagements. Myself and Dr. Clark have wargamed out a slightly alternate Operation C, which is based on some archival research we did. Was what if Somerville had held his course and run into Carrier Division 2 at night, which changes it completely from a carrier confrontation, which is actually quite interesting because the records from the two carriers show that Somerville actually kept his Swordfish with their with the ASV radars and everything. He kept them on deck and spotted, ready to go until about 10:30 at night.
Right.
So they could have launched a nighttime attack, which obviously the Japanese aren't ready to repel. But the weird thing is, every time we play that out, you get completely different results. Because with Carrier Division 2 off on their own, you kind of get what people might think of as a middling result of, Warspite finds two carriers operating essentially alone and recreates Matapan on a larger scale. Yeah. But then the big question comes about of what does Nagumo do, because he's got the other carriers, he's got the Congos, and you can construct plausible scenarios where he veers off and feeds a couple of escorts in to see what's going on, but keeps the rest of his carriers safe with most of the escorts, at which point those escorts also get chewed up by Warspite. But then he sends them all in and Warspite gets overwhelmed, or he just goes, hang on, we're just going to hang back and watch the fires on the horizon, and then come the morning, everyone's at point blank range, and he can launch, like, say, massive Japanese airstrike, because even if he loses Carrier Division 2, he still vastly outnumbers the British in terms of carrier aircraft.
Sure. Well, I guess the other thing I'd say there too is, I'd be scared of the escorts around Carrier Division 2. The Japanese knew what they were doing when it came to torpedo attacks at night, and
it would have been a mess.
Yeah, yikes! I don't want to take on 4 or 5, Yugumo class, destroyers, putting 8 fish in the water at a time. You're like,
the funniest thing we actually came up on with that little set of war games, we actually came on a scenario where Warspite and the escorting cruiser and destroyers are having to deal with the remnants of Carrier Division 2's escorts and possibly a Congo or two that's come sniffing around, which would mean that it would have to break off its attack on the carriers in order to deal with the bigger threats, which then leaves you in the bizarre circumstance of the two British carriers having to close on their Japanese counterparts to finish them off with 4.5-inch fire, which would have led to the hilarity of the first carrier versus carrier engagement, resulting in carriers being sunk by gunfire from other carriers, which is just like, okay, we're going to mark that one up into the if pigs had wings.
That's sort of, I'm just going to retrench back here to the conventional wisdom and say, 5 Japanese carriers versus your 2, I win.
I think this is kind of why we try and steer clear of alternate histories, isn't it? Because you can construct something that sounds plausible, and then the next minute you can construct something that's completely the opposite and also sounds plausible.
Right.
But there you go.
Back to your original point, which I think is very, very important and is difficult for a modern audience to really understand, which is, again, just how difficult it was to spot a warship from an airplane. We have this Yeah, we're all used to living in worlds where, we drive around in our
Mm,
cars and Siri whispers in our ears and we know where the hell we are, and it's all beautiful, right? And nothing could be further from the case, particularly in early 1942. Scouting operations were just, Hail Mary, where am I?
mm,
Um, these aircraft are being launched to go search an indistinguishable patch of ocean. In many cases, their navigational aids were nothing more than a paper map that is strapped to the leg of the pilot, and a pencil and a compass, and what are my dashboard
mm,
instruments telling me? So, and even the larger aircraft like a B-17 or a Catalina that might even have a navigator, in many cases, they're doing dead reckoning navigation as well. So that's
mm,
problem number one. I don't even really know where I am. In order to spot the ship, I'm going to be flying relatively low because I want to use the horizon and anything sticking up above that horizon as my main indication as to whether there's something out there. It's not a case of I'm flying at 30,000 feet and just looking down. That's actually not the way you do scouting, among other things, because any sort of cloud cover that's underneath you becomes more and more dense the farther away you're looking, and your angle of view is looking out. So most of these planes were down at 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 feet. They're pretty low
mm,
down. So, weather conditions down there become really important. How good are the lookouts in these things? How good is your radio communication? Even if I spot something, now I've got to put a sighting report in. I'm going to take my best guess as to where the hell I am and where they are and what speed they're moving and what direction they're moving. And I tap out a report, I'm at grid coordinate, I think here.
mm,
And now it gets into the pipeline where it's got to go through this whole chain of relays and whatnot. Coral Sea, the sighting reports are being sent to Australia, and then it's got to get out to the carriers at sea, and yada yada yada. So there can be multi-hour delays between when that information gets generated and when it's actually consumed on the bridge of a carrier, at which point that target A, you don't know if it's actually where he said it was, and B, it probably has moved a good 2-3 hours worth of distance during that time. So you see this pattern over and over and over again in early war naval battles, that the friction that's introduced by scouting operations is just a constant drag on trying to get your air groups up in the air and off to a target to hit them.
mm. Our next question says, I think I read somewhere that Jim Gray and VF6 loitered on the edge of the Japanese formation for around an hour before sending a sighting report. Has it ever been explained why it took that long?
I am not. I'm not as familiar with the details on that one as I should have been. Gray felt that he was kind of waiting around for torpedo bombers to show up for him to escort, and yeah, it was a fiasco. I mean, he basically loitered up there and did nothing to support VT8, among others. Even we don't necessarily know, I don't think, whether Gray even received the transmissions from VT8 that we're being shot to pieces, we need help. I do know, though, that when he landed back on Hornet, there was an incident where one of the aviators in the other air groups threatened him with a pistol. It was
Oof.
just so angry. Yeah, I mean, it
Mm.
was really bad.
Uh, okay, so then how big a part would you say clashing egos on either side played a part in the battle, if any?
That's an interesting question. I don't really think that's a huge issue on the American side. When I look at Nimitz as a commander, he was frankly, I think the finest naval officer that this country has ever produced. He was an astonishingly good judge of character. He was extremely good at allocating responsibilities to individuals, putting them in the right billets, moving them around if they didn't look like they were optimally producing. He was open to feedback and criticism. And so, I think Nimitz was just a fine commander. Likewise, you look at the task force level, Fletcher doesn't get nearly as much credit for the victory at Midway as was his due. And some of that is due to the fact that he very graciously turned over tactical command to Spruance in the middle of that battle when Yorktown got knocked out of the fight. And he was, transferring his flag to Astoria and trying to save Yorktown. He made an assessment that Spruance knew what he was doing and was running a good battle. And he basically said, "You've got the ball, go for it," which is a shockingly generous action, I think, very unselfish. And, he could easily have just hoisted his flag in Astoria, said, "Go to Task Force 16, I'll hoist my flag there, and I will take over tactical command again." But he didn't do that. Then you go to the Japanese side, and it's a completely different story. Yamamoto clearly was not interested in learning from his subordinate commanders during the war game exercises that went on during the battle. He was certainly not open to anyone brooking his overall operational scheme. Then when you get to the day of the battle itself, the real beef I have with their task force commanders, not so much with Nagumo. I think that Nagumo, in my mind, is sort of a tragic figure, that he had a very inadequate doctrinal playbook to work from. He made decisions that were doctrinally congruent that turned out to not, he was in a no-win position. Again, if we go back to the supposition that just attacking Midway at 0430 right there puts you behind the power curve, that's sort of what I see occurring with Nagumo. He's constantly playing catch-up and can never get back ahead of the 8-ball again. The guy I have a real beef with on the Japanese side is Yamaguchi. Mm-hmm. This whole business of taking Hiryu and essentially ramming her into the maw of the American carrier task forces is just idiocy. And I think what's going on there, and this is pop psychology on my part, and it's very dangerous to speculate when I am a white guy trying to analyze what's going on in a completely different culture. But what I see happening there is Yamaguchi comporting to Japanese cultural norms, which are: you cannot give up, you must fight down to the last bloody dribble, and then you have to atone for failure, if there is failure, with your own life. And that just ends up putting on blinders into this segment of the combat where it becomes this almost personal thing that I am doing. The problem being that, dude, you're on the last remaining aircraft carrier in this task force. This is an incredibly expensive, important national asset. Pull your perspective up and start thinking in terms of protecting national assets. This ship would be incredibly useful to us later on in the war. We need to preserve it. Do you want to counterattack? Absolutely you do. But given the range that your aircraft have, there's no reason why you can't hit these guys at extended range, maneuver your ship such that it's very close to the exits, so that when Hiryu's air power goes down and just into an attritional death spiral, you can say, "We're done, we out," and save that ship. He didn't do it.
Yeah, I think that ties into a position that I tend to take a lot of the time when people ask me to evaluate command decisions, which is, I come at it, I guess, possibly from a slightly more human perspective, in that I think, most captains, admirals, you have a duty to your crew to try and keep them alive as much as possible. Now, obviously, the national interest may require that you sacrifice your ship and crew in certain circumstances, but generally speaking, as you say, it's better for a ship normally to come out of a conflict intact, to live to fight another day. Right. Which then also ties into keeping your crew alive. So usually the two are congruent.
That's not the case in Japan. They were incredibly profligate in their usage of their human capital, and in many cases spending that human capital in ways that produced absolutely no military gain. You see that pattern over and over and over during the war.
Yeah. So another question. He says, this comparison may be a bit of a stretch, but would it be fair to say that Midway was an American version of the Battle of the Philippine Sea? I guess he's getting in terms of a technically outnumbered force coming in to try and stop an incoming invasion.
Hmm. Boy, I look at those two battles in completely different lenses. When I look at Philippine Sea, I see a Navy that is absolutely at the top of its game. And even though it's placed in a position by Spruance that they are not going to go charging off to the west and attack the incoming Japanese force that they know is there. I mean, I've always had this mental image of Raymond Spruance holding the leashes of Mark Mitcher and Jocko Clark and all of these just slavering attack dogs who want nothing more than just like, let's go, let's attack, you know. And Spruance is like, no, we're protecting the landing forces. Even though they were wrong-footed in that sense and are forced to then play defense, which is not at all what they wanted to play, the technical abilities that we bring into play during Philippine Sea are so overwhelming from a defensive standpoint. The anti-aircraft firepower is just jaw-dropping. We are flying second-generation fighters in the Hellcat. All of our aviators have got hundreds of hours of experience. Our fighter direction is just absolutely crackerjack. And, you know, the Japanese might have well have been fighting the Borg for all that they had a chance against, you know, the U.S. in that battle. So then compare that to Midway. This is a completely different situation for the Americans. This is the very beginning of this carrier war. As I mentioned earlier, you know, the doctrinal playbooks on both sides are very, very thin. You know, we're still making this up as we go along. We don't really know what works. So, yeah, I just see them in completely different lights.
Yeah, I must admit, actually, I've mentioned this in dry dock episodes before. One of the things that most impresses me about the Philippine Sea isn't necessarily the complete one-sided slaughter it turns into. It's actually more the absolute professionalism of the U.S. admirals who are in overall command. Because, as you said, they're looking at it and go, you know, there's every temptation to go charging for glory. They've got theoretically the forces on hand to do it, but they turn around and go, actually, what's our job here? Our job here is to protect the landings. We'll protect the landings. If the Japanese choose to throw themselves against us, so be it. But we're not going to abandon the landing forces and go chasing across the Pacific for a chance at blowing up something up. And to the point that, you know, Admiral Lee is in charge of the battleships and is asked, do you want to go in for a fast battleship action? And he takes one look and goes, I don't think we have enough night fighting training, so no. How many other admirals would have turned around and said, actually, no, we'll stay back and just do escort?
Right. Although, you know, again, that decision was very much Spruance's decision. I mean, if you read the accounts of, you know, Jocko Clark in particular, he was just bitterly angry over that decision for the rest of his life, because he saw there an opportunity, he felt, to utterly destroy the Japanese carrier force right then and there. He may have been right. But again, I think that you look at a guy like Jocko Clark or any of those task force carrier commanders, and in my mind, they are sort of the nautical equivalent of panzer generals. I mean, these are largely technical individuals. They are ferociously aggressive. That's what you're training them to do. But Spruance, again, has got his eye on the larger operational and strategic picture, which is to say, if I lose my landing force here, you know, that's unacceptable. And I don't care what Jocko Clark wants, you know, what trophies he wants to hang on his wall. That's immaterial to me in terms of running the war. And both King and Nimitz ended up backing up that decision later on.
Yeah. So, you'll like this one. So, person asks, is there any way I can get a signed copy of Shattered Sword?
Yes, there is. Actually, yeah, if you go to, I have a website up, shatteredswordbook.com, or just send me an email, johnp@combinedfleet.com, JONP@combinedfleet.com. And yes, I can get you an autographed copy. It's easier to do that in the U.S., I'll be honest. I have shipped copies overseas. They are phenomenally expensive. The most expensive copy of my book ever was sold to a guy in Moscow. And why he wanted it, I don't know. But yeah, The postage was twice as much as the stupid book.
Oh yeah,
So, but
I
yes,
I
yes, I
can
can.
I can sympathise with that. I had a package recently arrive from actually from St. Petersburg of all places, which
Ah,
yeah,
that's interesting.
full disclosure.
Particularly now.
Yeah, full disclosure. It was ordered before the current unpleasantness kicked off.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it had to take a very circuitous route.
Yeah. Wow.
Watching the tracking, I went through 5 different countries before it finally fetched up in Germany, of all places, and then
I
onto
was
the
going to
UK.
say probably Armenia is one of those, or
Mm.
yeah.
Let's just say it
Anyway,
went through a lot of Middle East places. Anyway, another question is how do you rate Fletcher's culpability in Yorktown's loss due to his decision to launch only one of his dive bomber groups in the initial attack?
um, I think again, Nimitz is being prudent there, in that scouting assets are the key to our being able to attack effectively. And so, yeah, he only sent one squadron of dive bombers off during that attack, but he did send it along with the torpedo plane squadron. And again, put yourself in our shoes or his shoes. We don't know at this point that the TBD Devastator is a death trap. Okay, so far as Fletcher knows, he's now put up um, a combined arms group, which is supposed to be a good thing, right? Of 2 squadrons escorted by fighters. I mean, that particular attack package, frankly, is arguably the most effective attack package that gets launched that morning, in that um, the torpedo planes that do attack end up sucking the majority of the Japanese combat air patrol into the southeast threat vector to go after VT3, leaving VB3 in a position to loop around and attack from the north. And during that assault on VT3, Jimmy Thatch, shows off the first usage of what's going to become known as the Thatch Weave, and manages to save most of the fighters in his group. Unfortunately, not most of the torpedo planes. But I guess I would look at that and I would say, here is a real example of using combined arms. It's the only occasion of it during the entire battle where you actually have a mixed attack package. And I can understand why Fletcher did not want to go with both dive bomber squadrons.
A few people, different people, chiming in, mentioning your contributions to Battle 360, saying thank you very much for those. One gentleman there saying, I'd like to thank Mr. Parshall for his involvement on the show Battle 360, which started my love of World War II history way back in 2009.
Oh my goodness. Full disclosure, I've never watched all of those. Isn't that silly? I
It's probably
I don't
similar to
watch.
me of watching my own videos. I can tend to take a view of, if I've recorded them, edited them, listened to them over for errors, etc. I've already heard the thing about 6 times before it goes live.
Right.
Why would I ever watch it again?
Right. Well, and in my case, I don't mind watching myself. In fact, I do watch myself sometimes just to kind of like try to get a sense for what could I have done better, how could I have paced that better. For me, the problem is TV. I don't watch hardly any TV because TV time is when books have to get written.
Mhm.
Authors are selfish bastards. I mean, that's the bottom line. And, something's got to give, or I can't sit my butt in a chair for multiple years and crank out a book. And TV time for me is one of the things that gives. But thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed that series. It was pretty fun to do.
So another question says, if Hiryu had had admittedly this is a slight alternate history, but if Hiryu had had a full complement of the new D4Y dive bombers with their heavier bomb loads, do you think they could have outrun the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft and hit and sunk Yorktown with the first strike?
That's a great question. Um, that's a really great question. Yeah, the D4Y was a great plane. You're absolutely
Mm.
right, and a very speedy little sucker too. Yeah, that's not a completely crazy outcome, to be honest. I mean, if you look at the damage that Yorktown sustains, it was already quite heavy, and it was only her damage control, and the fact that she had drained her fuel lines and pumped CO2 into them, which is the first occasion that that's ever been used in combat. That's the only reason that she escapes and is able to come back online relatively shortly thereafter. I think, you could make an argument that, yeah, a whole squadron of D4Ys, that's going to make a very difficult intercept solution for the Americans. The Wildcat is going to have a real problem getting up to altitude, and you're only going to get one pass.
Hmm.
So, then what happens if Yorktown gets hit by another bomb or two? That might have been, that could have been good night, Johnny. So, yeah, that's not beyond the realm of possibility, I don't think.
Um, and then we have, if Yorktown had not been able to participate in the battle, could the extra carrier air wings aboard her have been used on the other carriers and or somehow sent to Midway?
I think that's somewhat less likely. There had been experiments with the Lexington where they had operated air groups of up to 100 aircraft. And what they found was it was just, at that point, without a deck edge lift, it made air group evolutions just really, really difficult to do. Um, I mean, theoretically, could you have packed more aircraft into both of those Yorktown class carriers? Yeah, my guess is you probably could have. Um, could you have beefed up Midway? I'm not sure. My sense from what you see of the air group activity on Midway itself was that island was full of airplanes. There
Mm.
wasn't a lot of extra real estate left around to put extra aircraft, particularly after the first day when they had gotten the fuel pumping station had been demolished by the morning attack, and so now you're hand pumping gasoline. So interesting question.
Mm.
I don't know that they would have done that. My sense is that in order to put more aircraft on the carriers, you probably would have ended up having to, do things like split up squadrons and stuff like that. I don't know that they would have wanted to do that, but I don't
Mm.
know. Interesting
Yeah.
question.
So, it says, for both of us, who are your most influential naval historians or dash authors that you read in your formative years?
That's a great question. Um, wow.
I can probably answer my
You
one if
do
you
it.
want. For me, probably the two most influential in the my early years of getting into properly reading naval history would actually be Julian Thompson and D.K. Brown. D.K. Brown, because he wrote an absolutely fantastic series as a ship designer. You've got Before the Ironclad, Warrior to Dreadnought, the Grand Fleet, Nelson to Vanguard, and then he did also do one that's after 1945, rebuilding the Royal Navy. And for someone with an engineering bent like me, there's some summaries of the technical development of ships really
Mm,
appealed to me.
sure.
But that was once I knew I was properly interested in going deep into naval history. The first full on proper historical book I read, which I still have, as a gift from my grandmother many, many, many years ago, was the Imperial War Museum of the War at Sea, Second World War, by Julian Thompson. And that, I think, as well as obviously visiting Victory when I was very young, was kind of the kickoff for me, because it's not particularly heavy on the details of ship X went to Y position and did Z. It kind of assumes that people know a lot of that general history, but what it is mostly full of survivors' accounts from the various battles. So it's kind of like for example, Matapan. It would be like, okay, so the British turned up at Matapan, the Italians. It gives you like a 3-paragraph summary of how the Matapan situation started, and then it's just so and so was there and recalled this, so and other person was here and recalled this, and you see and hear the battle, whether it's Matapan, the Atlantic convoys, the Arctic convoys, North Cape Bismarck. You hear it through the words of the people who were there, and the way they put it, obviously very well put interviews. And I was just like, yep, no, that's it, I'm in.
Interesting. Yeah, for me, I guess the gateway drugs were a little bit different. My dad is a retired college English prof. He taught at an engineering school for years and years. And he used to ride his bike out to school, and he would ride right past the Naval Reserve Center. And he knew I was into naval stuff as a little kid, and he started making arrangements with them to ship him the 16 millimeter reel to reel films of Victory at Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And since Dad was a teacher, he could bring home a projector. And so he would do that. He would bring home a projector and these reels, a couple episodes at a time, and we would just show them on my living room wall. And I do remember distinctly some of the Guadalcanal images that came out of that of the Japanese warships, and I was immediately struck by those. I really liked how their ships looked. When I was a sixth grader, I built a 1/700 scale kit of one of their heavy cruisers, Haguro, and that was it. You know, as a sixth grade boy, your decision making faculties aren't necessarily all that sophisticated. And I was just like, this is the coolest looking ship I've ever seen in my life. And I was totally into the Japanese Navy. I did have one of those Time Life books on the Pacific War as a whole that I just read obsessively. I checked out of the school library over and over and over and over again. And then I guess when I got a little bit older, now we're talking early teens, I did a lot of wargaming, Panzer Leader, Panzerblitz, those sorts of things. And I did read Walter Lord's Incredible Victory, and what an author. I mean, my goodness, such a gifted writer. And then he turned out to be such a great guy too. When Tony and I were working on Shattered Sword, we reached out to Walter to see if we could get some of the interview notes for some of the officers that he had talked to. He had Parkinson's at that point in an advanced state, and he was not able to help us, but he told his personal secretary, give these guys whatever it is that they want. So he was incredibly generous and gracious to us, and helped our efforts immeasurably. So I really honor Walter Lord's memory, because he was really great to us.
That's good to know. Someone just asking, it says, I know this isn't too related to the topic, but I was wondering how I might identify a US World War II era ship based on personnel records, as his great-grandfather was a destroyer captain in the US Navy during World War II. Now, obviously, feel free to answer yourself, but as far as I'm aware, if it works anything like it works in the UK, then they should be able to request their great-grandfather's personnel records. And again, if it's anything like the UK, there will be a record of ships they served on. Because all the UK service records, it's like, joined, rank, served on this ship, and it's just basically a grid. So if it's anything like that, then in theory, if they request them from the US National Archives at this point, or maybe the USN directly, they should be able to just find that.
Actually, in the US, this is my understanding. I don't do this kind of stuff, okay? I'm an operational level guy. I don't go down to that level. And no disrespect there. That's a great thing to do. It's just, it ain't my thing. My friend Mike Wenger, who's writing a multi-volume series on Pearl Harbor, that's the world he lives in. And my understanding is that those are held in an archive in St. Louis. Some of them have been lost. The rest of them are literally in cardboard boxes, 80-year-old cardboard boxes. And you can imagine the state that a lot of those records are in. But again, just given the gigantic size of the Navy by the end of the war, just the sheer unapproachability of being able to digitize all those records, it just ain't happening. So if you're seriously interested in finding out more about your grandfather, you got to go to St. Louis, and you got to paw through boxes. That's how you do it. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there we go. Another question says, is there any truth to the Japanese claims that machine guns on the Zero were ineffective at taking down American aircraft and their cannon shells were too slow?
Yeah, I do think that the Japanese had an appreciation for the fact that, when they first started encountering aircraft like the B-17, that thing was a bear to knock down. A 30 caliber machine gun bullet just isn't really going to get it done against something like that. Um, and just the design of the Zero, where you've got a very limited amount of cannon ammo on the Zero, and the trajectory of the 20 millimeter cannon was it is, as you say, a lower velocity weapon, and therefore it had a shorter drop off. You couldn't bore sight it by using your 7.7 millimeters and then opening up with the cannons. You had to still, if that target were a fair amount away, you had to take into account the fact that your shells are going to drop even more. So, was that a problem? Yeah, I think that was a known problem, but there really wasn't much of a fix for it as far as the Japanese were concerned. And if you were a good Zero pilot, you just kind of learned to compensate for it.
Fair enough. And we've got what have we got here? So this is similar to one we did talk about before. It says everyone talks about the carriers at Midway, but did a Japanese or American destroyers see much action beyond providing some anti-aircraft fire support?
Well, you've got an example of like the Arashi, or maybe not the Arashi. There's actually some controversy about that. The common wisdom has always been that the Arashi kept the submarine Nautilus's head down with depth charge attacks in order to let Kitabutai's carriers move out of that region. The reason that's controversial is because Arashi was the squadron leader. And Tony in particular has dug into this, and the scuttlebutt from the Japanese side is it wasn't Arashi that would do that, because Arashi's the squadron leader. She would have designated one of the flunky ships to go out there and keep that submarine's head down. So, the Japanese were busy doing anti-submarine stuff during the morning. They put in a number of different attacks against the Nautilus during that time. They did not contribute in any sort of a meaningful way, though, to the anti-aircraft protection of their carriers, partly because Japanese doctrine was for the carrier to maneuver freely. And so the escorts in many cases were just like, yeah, we're just trying to stay out of your way so we don't get run down by a 45,000 ton carrier charging around. And they didn't carry a lot of firepower either. So were they involved in those actions? Yeah, they were, but they didn't really play any sort of a material part. The destroyer Tanakaze, when would this be? This would be the morning of the 5th, is sent back to look for Hiryu, because Hiryu, of course, is spotted in the morning by a Japanese scout plane. And she's still afloat. We're supposed to have scuttled the ship, and then the scout plane comes back and is taking pictures of Hiryu still afloat. And there were a great number of raised eyebrows about that. And Tanakaze was given the unwanted duty of going back to, first of all, make sure that ship is scuttled, but also this aircraft has said that there were crewmen on the flight deck waving at the aircraft. We want to get off too. And of course, that's the chief engineer, a guy named Ayamune, and his black gang has made it up out of the engines. Well, anyway, Tanakaze gets sent off on this mission during that morning, and she just gets bombed on a number of occasions because the Americans are out looking for Hiryu. Hiryu has by then sunk, but Tanakaze is kind of like, doing her thing. And so, yeah, she draws a lot of fire, but is very nimble and does not get hit by any of those bombs. So I guess the bottom line from the Japanese perspective is, yeah, they had some excitement in there, but they didn't contribute a whole heck of a lot. Right. And I think, as we discussed on the American side, pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. Then another question for you. Can you comment on how the high operational tempo of the Kitabuttai between Pearl Harbor and Midway may have affected its material condition at Midway, in terms of lack of refits for radar, AA, etc.?
Absolutely. Great question, and a very pertinent question, because there's certainly evidence that high operational tempo was starting to affect the readiness of the air groups, for instance. Now, Nagumo does a lot of belly aching in his report about the poor state of training of his aviators. Tony and I looked somewhat askance in that, yeah, there may not have been as much training going on during that time, but certainly these air groups have been running a lot of combat operations, and they certainly know what they're doing from that perspective. I mean, there are a lot of operations that have just kind of, faded into memory, but, they bombed Port Darwin in Australia. They launched a number of air attacks against Java, Gillett Jap on the southern coast and so forth. They were mopping up Allied assets around the south of Java during the March timeframe. Indian Ocean gets thrown in there. Carrier Division 2 was present at Wake, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, by the time you get to Midway, I think what you do have, though, is you got a lot of very tired air crews and tired ship crews as well. The ships were in need of refit, for sure. Akagi was slated to have a new suite of anti-aircraft guns put aboard her immediately after Midway. They were going to replace her old style 1929 vintage 120 millimeter guns with the more modern 127 millimeter Type 89s. So there was a recognition, I think, at a higher level that these ships are tired and they do need refit. That's one of the reasons that if you look at some of the strategic deliberations that are going on in the March timeframe, Admiral Kusaka, one of the strategic options that they did look at was to just say, we're done. The defensive perimeter is what it is right now in March. We've captured Java. We've gotten all the oil. Let's get the ships in the docks. Let's refit their air groups, start beefing up the defensive perimeter, and get ready to play defense. That option obviously did not end up getting selected, but there was certainly an awareness, I think, within the Navy as a whole that, yes, the first phase operations have been highly successful, but they were also exhausting.
And speaking of exhausting, the next question is, how depleted were the American aerial forces after the battle in terms of planes and personnel? Could they have mounted another major airstrike if necessary before
Yes.
reinforcements come in from Pearl and Saratoga shows up?
Yes, they could have. Yeah, for sure they had lost a number of aircraft, but of course the Japanese have lost all of theirs. I forget what the aircraft losses are off the top of my head. I want to say that the Americans lost, over 100 planes all totaled. But again, those three flight decks between them had around 260 aircraft. So certainly in terms of dive bombers, they retained a very healthy number of dive bombers, as you can see by the firepower that was meted out against Mikuma and Mogami during the following days. These were still effective air groups.
Oh, this is going to be an interesting one. What, in your opinion, was the Japanese Navy's greatest doctrinal, operational, and tactical failings that led to the disaster that they suffered? It seems to the questioner that damage control and perhaps lack of proper fighter direction were up there as top reasons. Is that correct, or were there other major aspects of their performance that are contributory factors?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. Let's look at fighter direction, because I think that is really important. And now you have to ask yourself, in the days before radar, could you have effective fighter direction? I kind of think the answer is no. Yeah, and that's a real problem for the Japanese. They've only just put their first operational, they weren't even operational, they were experimental sets of radars on the battleships Issei and Hyuga just a month prior to the battle. So there really wasn't much time, even if they'd done some sort of a hurry up effort and maybe put an experimental set on one of the carriers. In fact, one of the really interesting mysteries about the battle for a number of years, the air group commander or the air officer on board the Kaga, it was a guy named Amagai. And he swore up and down that here you had a radar set at the Battle of Midway. He made that statement during the strategic bombing survey interviews right after the war, and the Americans were like, really, and it's not true. And I don't know if he was intentionally lying about it, or what the deal was, but we know that Hiryu did not have a radar set aboard her. Among other things, the photographic evidence of Hiryu's island as taken by their own scout plane makes it clear that she didn't have radar. The problem is a lot of people sort of associate the existence of radar to mean that automatically then you can do fighter direction, right? In fact, if we go back to that earlier question around, comparing Midway to the Battle of Philippine Sea, one of the things you got to look at is the American development of the Combat Information Center. And this is something that Trent Hone just really drills into in his books and just really talks it up. It's one thing to have a basic piece of technology, but then you've also got to develop the doctrinal and organizational pieces that go around that technology to be able to use it effectively. And the CIC is what makes that happen for the Americans. The ability to take all of these sensor inputs, not just radar, but also radio intercepts and, the traffic that's coming back from your fighter pilots and all that stuff, and plot it in one place so that a commanding officer can look at the table and say, this is what's going on. That's a huge development. And the Japanese did not make that same conceptual leap until around 1944. And so far as I know, we have evidence that they put CICs in some of their cruisers for night fighting purposes, but I do not know that they ever did that for their carriers from a fighter direction standpoint. So now winding it all back to Midway, yeah, this is a horrible vulnerability on the part of the Japanese. The fact that they're basically relying on a bunch of guys up in the air without any centralized control whatsoever. They're doing things like, if a surface warship sights aircraft coming in from that direction, I start shooting that way to raise water spouts to get the attentions of the yahoos up in the aircraft to say, by the way, go over that direction. So as we point out in the book, one of the real problems that the Japanese have is that their combat air patrol really can't handle anything other than a single vector, single altitude kind of attack. That's why it falls apart at 1020, because they're being attacked from 3 different directions and multiple different altitudes. They can't assimilate the information. They don't even know what's out there. They get slammed. So that's a big failing. I think from a strategic standpoint, the biggest failing that the Japanese have prior to Midway is just not being able to rationalize what it was that they were trying to do in this stupid war. They didn't have a conception of how to bring the Americans to the bargaining table other than just keep hitting us in the face and hoping that we're going to fold. And they're trying to do way too many things all at the same time. You'll notice that during Midway itself, they're attacking not only Midway, but they're going after the Aleutians. And this is at the same time coming on the heels of an operation that was aimed down in the Coral Sea a month prior. As we say in the book, there were 2 kinds of operation in the Pacific. Either operations where you brought none of your carriers or operations where you bring everything. Because if there's one thing that the Japanese had going for them at this point in the war, they've got the bigger sledgehammer, right? You don't want to fritter that away. So pick your targets carefully, bring the whole sledgehammer, destroy the target and take it, instead of sort of frittering your forces around, we're going to go after the Coral Sea, we're going to go after the Aleutians. That's not a good way of running a war.
I just remember to take my microphone off mute.
Yeah.
It usually helps. So there's one question that I can quickly answer because I've come across this so many times. Someone asking how did Yorktown get repaired so quickly before the battle? The short answer is that she wasn't fully repaired. They patched her up. They got her in a condition where she could go out to sea, but the worst damage was when the bomb at Coral Sea had gone down and blown through some of the trunking to her funnel and knocked out some of the machinery. That wasn't repaired, and so she was limited in speed compared to being a standard Yorktown class carrier could hit well over 30 knots. Yorktown was 28-ish knots unless you really pushed it. So that's where you get this whole dichotomy of 3 months. 3 months repairs was to strip down, take out, repair, and replace all the damaged machinery. The perfect. And then the 3 days was, this is what we need to get the thing back out there and as an operational flight deck, even if it's not ideal.
Thank you. No, that sums it up very nicely. That's exactly what went on. And again, America, we're just going to throw a lot of resources at this problem and do the best we can. I mean, they put 1,500 dockside workers aboard that ship, and they worked around the clock with very little in the way of break. This was not a union job, These guys some of them worked, literally without sleep for 60 hours. Eating sandwiches, and taking 5-minute breaks, and it was an all hands on deck evolution. Everyone in this shipyard is on this one ship, and we're going to get this puppy turned around and get it up to the battle. And yes, there was a very shrewd triage effort, which isolated the things that could be fixed in that time frame and the things that could not. The perfect is the enemy of the good. We just need the ship to be able to develop a reasonable battle speed such that she can conduct flight operations and defend herself. And that's good enough. And the other thing that's going on during this whole time too is not only is the ship being repaired, but it's also being resupplied. I mean, she's been down on the South Pacific now for months. And so, we've got to, get enough food aboard her. They did some very sketchy things during this effort too, in terms of they didn't fully drain her of her aviation or fuel oil when they put her in the dry dock, which made for some real dicey conditions because, if you haven't judged her stability characteristics exactly, think about what happens if that ship tilts and, you rupture the aviation fuel tanks or something horrid like that. I mean, there was danger involved in this evolution, but it gives you an indication for the level of expertise of the ship repair staff that we did have at Pearl at that point. A lot of whom, frankly, had been involved in salvage operations of the battleships that had been sunk there during Pearl Harbor. 6 months into the war, these guys know what the hell they're doing.
Yeah. Speaking of things that were lost or damaged, we've got a question saying, what happened to the planes from the carriers that were lost or damaged on both sides?
Ended up on the bottom in a lot of cases. There's still hundreds of planes out there. A lot of them, of course, were physically destroyed inside the hangars of the Japanese carriers. The ones that were beaten up on the American carriers in many cases are just shoved over the side of the ship. I mean, if we know that we're not going to be able to do an effective repair on this bird, over the side it goes. You look at some of the photographs of some of the land-based aircraft. So of those 6 TBFs, which were also part of Hornet's complement, understand, the 6 TBF Avengers that flew off of Midway Island were from VT-8. And so they too were sort of, sole survivors, if you will, much like Ensign Gay. Only one of those 6 planes makes it back to Midway, and it's just absolutely shot to pieces. I forget the number of machine gun holes it had in it. Harry Ferrier was one of the 2 aviators on that plane that made it home alive, and I met him twice. He still had a baseball cap that he was wearing during the battle. He was 17 years old when he went out on that plane, and it had a hole right in the crown of that baseball cap where a 7.7 millimeter machine gun bullet came in, creased his skull, knocked him cold. And he wakes up in 10 minutes or whatever, covered in blood, not only from himself, but also from the gunner who's been killed above him in the ball turret on that Avenger. So yeah, you want to talk about a harrowing experience for a 17-year-old young man. That plane makes it back and is just shot to pieces. They kept that one though because they wanted to take it back to Grumman to let Grumman analyze the battle damage and see where they could make improvements. The fact that
Hmm.
it made it home at all was a miracle.
Um, and then we have another one. If you were Admiral Yamamoto, when and where would you choose the site for the Great Kantai Kessen decisive battle? Presumably not Midway.
Well, no, actually, here's the thing. I don't think that Midway is a bad place to attack. The question is where to attack versus how to attack, right? Um, I think that Yamamoto's basic logic is essentially sound. I want to precipitate a battle that is close enough to Oahu that it will elicit a strong reaction from the Americans. And at the same time, I want that place to be far enough away from Oahu that the organic air power that's on Oahu can't, come up and mess around with me because I can only bring so many carriers to the party. So I don't think that Midway is a bad place to go. And likewise, too, yes, could you could accept the Naval General Staff's recommendation of moving down the line of the Solomon Islands and trying to cut off Australia's supply lines by going after a place like Fiji or Tonga. Um, that's another possibility. But the reason that the Central Pacific recommends itself to Yamamoto is, first of all, the logistics are just a lot easier there than they are way down near, the equator. Two, if you can capture Midway, and if by some crazy happenstance you manage later on to capture Oahu, having Oahu really would have been a very big bargaining chip at the table if you had ever brought the Americans there. So I buy into all of that. I just think his battle plan was lousy.
Hmm.
He had the ability to come in with, a 10-pound sledgehammer and just beat our brains out, and he should have. He should have waited. Well, first of all, he should never have agreed to the Naval General Staff asking him for carriers for Coral Sea because capturing Port Moresby is just asinine and stupid. So he sort of said no. And then when they said, well, you're going to have to go and take the Aleutians, he should have said no. I'm bringing all 6 of my carriers, maybe 8, to Midway, and I'm going to crush their skulls. I'm going to take that island, and then I'm going to do the same thing, closer to Oahu later on down the road. Again, it's dispersion of effort over too many objectives. That's my biggest objection with
Hmm.
Yamamoto, not his selection of the battle site.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I suppose it's obviously a perfectly valid one considering that the Japanese are the ones with the smaller navy.
Right.
So it's like no smaller force has ever won a war by going, yeah, you know what, let's take our outnumbered force and split it across 16 different fronts. That's a good idea.
Although at this point in the war, it is the larger navy in the Pacific. They
Hmm.
did outnumber us numerically at this point in the war. So you've got that sort of window of opportunity, but you need to use it wisely because if
Hmm.
you lose this carrier force, if you start looking at the dynamics of the shipbuilding programs during the war, once Japan loses Kitabutai, it's
Hmm.
over. They will never be able to get that trump card back.
Yeah. Yeah. So then we've got early in World War II, US carrier doctrine was for distinct task forces centered on single carriers, while the Japanese operated in pairs in an overall fleet formation. Was Midway proof that the US's doctrine was the better one, inasmuch as their air attacks were able to take on multiple decks at once, I guess with the Kage and Kaga, while the Japanese strikes were only able to hit a single carrier at a time, and indeed the same carrier, Yorktown, both times?
I don't know that I would characterize it in terms of offensive operations. I would look at it defensively. That what you see in the American um, predisposition towards multiple formations is a belief that they don't want to put all their eggs in one basket. That from a defensive standpoint, the last thing they want to do is get slammed with an attack that destroys 2 or 3 ships all at once. The Japanese, um, are erring towards the side of maximal offense, that the only way to really coordinate these assets effectively is to have them within eyesight of each other so that we can put up these big combined air groups. You know, Fletcher and Nimitz both, after the battle, acknowledged that the Japanese did offensive carrier operations better than the Americans could do. If you look at the ability that the Japanese had to coordinate multiple flight decks and get these big air groups put together, the Americans couldn't do that. They couldn't do that until 1940, end of 1943. Okay, but what the Americans were betting on was that the defense was the stronger form of warfare, and that given the fragility of these carrier assets, it was important to physically separate them so that they couldn't all be knocked out at one time. Is that the correct approach? You know, given the Japanese experience, yeah, I think you would have to conclude that it was. The Japanese certainly came to the same conclusion, because if you look at their carrier doctrine that replaces their current doctrine at Midway, which is Third Fleet doctrine, that gets promulgated right before the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Now all of a sudden they're doing things in dispersed carrier groups, precisely because it's a passive damage control mechanism.
Fair. So we've. What's this? Okay. How extensive was the fallout in Imperial Japanese Naval High Command in the aftermath of the defeat at Midway? In particular, did Yamamoto's enemies in the battleship camp gain enough momentum to seriously threaten his position?
No. Isn't that interesting? What you see in the Battle of Midway is the beginning of an extensive disinformation campaign on the part of the Japanese, where they're not only lying to the Japanese public, they're lying to themselves. I think that from the Navy's perspective, the Imperial Navy, their biggest enemy wasn't Yamamoto, it was the Imperial Army. You know, so the last thing that they want to do is open themselves up to criticism on the part of the Army. Furthermore, Yamamoto at this point in time was a rock star. I mean, he spent an appreciable portion of his day answering adoring fan mail from, you know, school kids and stuff like that. So if you are launching a disinformation campaign to the Japanese people, where you are portraying Midway as a tremendous victory and are only admitting later on that, oh, by the way, we lost Kaga and damage to another ship, you know, they were very grudging about giving out that information. So you've positioned this as a victory to the Japanese people. You can't very well cashier Yamamoto now, can you? Because a guy with that level of prominence within the Japanese population, if you were to suddenly cashier him, people are going to start asking questions as to why that was the case. So I find that one of the really sort of shocking things about the outcome of Midway, that not only does Yamamoto keep his job, Nagumo keeps his job too. And in fact, this is the same pair that will go on down to Eastern Solomons to do their thing down there. So, yeah, I think from a doctrinal perspective, the Japanese did learn some lessons. But if you look at the level of command and control, no, they played cover up, you know, absolutely to the hilt.
Then we have, were the Japanese actually quicker in launching their aircraft, or was it simply a matter that they were only launching a portion of their air group versus the Americans trying to launch most of theirs off of a single deck?
What you see in there, again, is a difference in a operational approach. How do we put together these sorts of air groups? This goes back to the actual creation of First Air Fleet and its operational, you know, equivalent Kitabutai. This happens in April of 1941, right before, you know, during the lead up to Pearl Harbor. So Yamamoto gives these orders to create this thing called First Air Fleet. And we're going to put all of our carriers in one basket. We're going to learn how to use them. Great, guys, go do that. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of, you know, nitty gritty little details. How do you actually make that happen? How do you take a group of 4, soon to be 6 aircraft carriers in one formation and get it to the point where you can actually put up an air group of 180 planes all at once. Nobody does that. Nobody knows how to do that. So you got to start going through the evolution of, well, okay, am I going to launch all the carrier air group at once, or am I just going to launch a piece of it? And so what the Japanese come to is this thing called a deck load strike, because the real estate on the flight deck is limited, obviously. And so what they end up coming to the conclusion is each carrier is going to put up one of their squadrons, either dive bombers or torpedo bombers, and a package of fighters to go along with them as an escort, because that group of 24 to 27 planes fits nicely on the flight deck and can all be launched at one time. And now if we multiply that by 4 or 6 carriers, lo and behold, boom, you have these big air groups that we can go off and do things with. So all during the fall of 1941, the Japanese are frantically trying to figure out all of this stuff. And there's other stuff too, what formation are these carriers going to steam in during the night, during the day, during flight operations, during, blah, blah, blah. Once those planes go up in the air, how are they going to be commanded? Is it going to be individual squadron commanders for all of them, or are we going to have an overall commander? That's the determination they eventually come to. For Pearl Harbor, they put Fuchida in charge of this big air group, but they did that kind of over the dead bodies of some of the carrier skippers who just hated that like holy hell. So there's this sort of frantic adaptation of the Japanese carrier force that's happening during this time, and that's one of the reasons I think the Americans are so surprised by Pearl Harbor, is that we had done none of that work and didn't know how to do any of that work. So what you see then, fast forward now to Midway, one of the problems that the Americans had with their air launches during the battle was that they tried to put up too many planes in the air at one time. You see that on both Hornet and Enterprise, that they're breaking the spot. They're doing the launches in multiple packages, which means that now I've got airplanes that are just kind of circling around overhead, burning gasoline, waiting for the guys that are still back down on the flight deck to hurry up and get launched. To the point that Spruance in the middle of that launch cycle is just like, just go, which is why you end up having, I have 6 different packages of American aircraft in squadron-sized penny packets, in all different directions going all over the place. I guess the larger point I'm trying to make here is that the Japanese knew how to run their deck operations, and the Americans really didn't.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of see that at Santa Cruz and Eastern Solomons, where both sides are trying to launch squadron-sized strike formations, and even then the Japanese are getting the formations off a lot quicker.
Yes.
Quick question. Sorry.
I was just going to say, one last codicil to that. Yeah, so if you look at the morning strike of Nagumo's 4 carriers against Midway, he launches a strike package of 108 aircraft in 8 minutes, gets them up in the air, formed up, and off to the target, within about 10. The Americans, on the other hand, struggle to put up a similar number of aircraft during their launch cycle around the 0730 to 0800 timeframe. It takes those same carriers an hour to put up the same number of aircraft. We just didn't know what we were doing. Only Yorktown knew what they were doing.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, what's that question gone? Oh, yeah, the quick one was, any update on on a timeline of release for your 1942 book? As the questioner is very much looking forward to it.
That's that's an important question to a lot of people, including my wife. I am making good progress, actually. It's amazing what being a self-employed historian will do for you when you don't have a day job anymore. I have recently completed all the maps for the book, which is a non-trivial undertaking. Since there are about 90 different maps that I had to do. My dad is finished with the editing of the Mediterranean narrative. I'm going to give him a little break, and then I'm going to foist the Eastern Front stuff on him, which is big. I have to completely rewrite the Pacific narrative. I think it's just way too big. I don't know. I still think we're talking another couple of years, but I'm definitely grinding away at it, and I will say that I'm being very disciplined about it. I treat it as my job. I get up every morning, I come downstairs, I sit in front of my computer for 6 to 8 hours, and I work on my stupid book. So we're getting there.
Fair enough.
Yep.
We'll have to have a big online launch party when it gets done.
I'll take it. Yeah.
Either that or I'll have to fly out over there and we can just do it a single live stream.
That'd be lovely. We'd have a great time.
Yeah.
I mean, the bar is just sitting right over there, man. You're
Yeah.
always welcome.
There you
Here
go.
at Parshall Sullivan. Yeah.
Excellent. So, it's kind of a two-part question. Regarding Japanese language academic work into Midway, have you seen anything new in this space over the past couple of years?
No. And I'll tell you this straight up. I've been so busy with this 1942 book that I am not necessarily up to speed on the latest, greatest scholarship that is coming out in Japan. Tony has stayed much more abreast of that than I have. And he's also been doing things like he's got a Chinese co-author, a guy named Lu Yu, that he's done some articles for the War College Review for. So Tony is more plugged into that stuff than I am at this point, honestly. I will say that one of the things that is kind of cool is that machine translation has gotten to the point now where if you throw modern Japanese at it, you can get some pretty decent results. Tony has been using just the translation mechanism on his Apple phone, and has been getting some pretty cool stuff. I know that I actually have a friend on Facebook who is Chinese and can read Japanese, and he is starting to take a crack at doing a translation of the Midway volume of Senshi Sosho, which is harder to do from a machine translation standpoint because it's older style academic Japanese and it's just a bear. I continue to think that there's got to be good stuff over in Japan that we just don't know about.
Yeah. I've actually been doing something similar with some Japanese sort books that cover details that just aren't covered in English, and scanning them in with OCR technology, and then just going, Google Translate. What does this page say? And so I had a similar experience. Yeah, modern Japanese. It's like some of the word forms are slightly anachronistic, but I can make out what they mean. I mean, sometimes it's even silly things like.
What are you looking at?
I was actually mostly looking at the Unryu class carriers because there wasn't a tremendous amount written there. But it's like, for example, they're talking about launching what we call the Meteor. No, what we call the Comet. One of the late war Japanese aircraft, and I kept coming across these references to meteor launches off of the carrier, and for a while I was stumped, and then I realized it's a variant of the translation software. It's the same word, but it's calling it a meteor rather than the comet element. So and then someone sent me a few pages of a volume of Sensei Shoho. I stuck it in, and it came out. I was like, what?
Garbage. Exactly. But some of the more modern stuff, like there's a I'm looking around for it on my shelf. Actually, I don't see it. There's a book by a woman named Sawachi Hisai, Midway Kaisen Kyuroku, which is one of the most stunning pieces of primary source research I've ever seen in my life. She went back through Japanese prefectural records and found the name, province of birth, date of service, age of time of death, rank, blah, 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 for every single one of the 3,507 Japanese who were lost in the battle, and all the Americans too.
Wow.
It's amazing. If you're willing to paw through it, she's got the casualty rolls for every single carrier and every guy on every carrier. But she also has a narrative section, and she makes the claim in her book, and this came out a number of years ago, that this whole business about having a reserve strike force that is armed with torpedoes, that is going to be kept in reserve if any American ships were there, she claims it was never even armed. That those torpedo planes were just down in the hangar, and probably Nagumo was planning on using them for a land attack anyway, and so why would he even bother arming them with torpedoes? I don't know if that's true, but it's a fascinating claim. And I know that there are other scholarly works out there that I'm sure we could learn more about Midway from in Japan.
Yeah, it's I think the follow-up question is that's related to Japanese language sources. Any hypothesis on why misrecollections or mistakes seem quite common? I mean, I would suspect it's somewhat similar to a lot of the German narratives that came out after World War II, where magically everything was Hitler's fault.
Right.
If I suppose if you're on the losing side, it's very easy to just point to this person who is conveniently dead or has been
Yes.
conveniently convicted of horrific war crimes and no one's ever going to listen to. He's the one who's at fault for everything. I, of course, was a complete, perfectly spherical genius in a vacuum who would
Yes.
who would won the war single-handed if only they'd listened to me.
If only they'd listen to me. Right. Exactly. And you detect elements of that in Fuchida's account as well. In fact, when Tony and I sent off a couple of physical letters to a couple of different Japanese historians, we were sort of becoming aware that stuff about Fuchida's account just didn't smell right. It just didn't jibe with what we were seeing in the Air Group records. And one of the letters came back to me from a guy named Hyodo Nisohachi. And the first line in Hyodo's letter to me was, to understand why Fuchida's book is a pack of transparent lies.
Not pulling their punches there.
Oof, and the Japanese, as a rule, don't really like pointing fingers at people and being, really upfront about blaming somebody. So to get a line like that out of a letter, I was just like, boom. But to your point, he says that essentially there's kind of cover up going on. I look at Fuchida as being sort of the front man of this cabal of First Air Fleet officers who are trying to come up with a better smelling account for what happened at Midway. And Hyodo lumps Kusaka's book in with Fuchida's book. Kusaka also came out with a book in the 1950s. He called them cheering up accounts. Where, you're trying to make it smell better than it actually was. And of course, for both of them, you're absolutely right. Nagumo was conveniently dead. He died on Saipan in 1944. Yamamoto was conveniently dead as well. So you make those guys out to be the idiots. And Fuchida certainly, I told them, we should have had a two-phased air search and, that kind of stuff. So there is an element of that. The other thing that I do think that goes on, though, is I think you have to be very careful in using first-person accounts at all times. That there may not even be any sort of intentional lying about events, but when you're in combat, it just does weird things to human memory. Time tends to get distorted. It can be distended or contracted. You often find in veteran accounts that they'll remember an event fairly clearly, but they can't put it into its correct place in the sequence of events. You think about some of the fragmentary dive bomber accounts that you get from the U.S. pilots. Think about the situation they're in. They're on this 10,000-foot roller coaster where I'm trying to hit. I got to put my ordnance on target, and this goddamn ship is, maneuvering in a great big circle at 30 knots. And how do I hit this thing? So are they paying attention to the larger picture of what's going on around in the task force at the time? Of course not. Which makes Dick Best's situational awareness to realize that his own dive has just been spoiled, and oh my God, Akagi is getting away. We need to go nail her. That's an exceptional response from a very, very savvy airman. So I guess the larger point I'm trying to make here is you got to be real careful about first-person accounts. They may not be lying to you intentionally, but they're viewing their war through the soda straw, and they can only see so much, and they may not be able to put it effectively into a larger context.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, not that I've ever been in an actual war, but as you know, I probably know I do medieval reenactment, historical European martial arts, and airsoft, which is like they're high intensity activities. Right. And if I'm doing a reenactment battle, some fights when I'm in them, it can seem like it's lasted 30 seconds, and you come out of it and you're like, why am I so exhausted? That was really short. And then you watch someone who's videoed it on playback, and it's actually 6 or 7 minutes, and you could swear blind you were not in there for more than 30 seconds. And the flip side of sometimes you can be like, okay, this must be hour 3 of this exercise. I'm out of ammo. I'm tired. I'm thirsty. I'm hot. How long? Shouldn't we have gone to lunch by now? And so we've only been out here half an hour.
Right.
And
Oh,
if that can set in with people who are doing something where you know that you're safe, bar the the instinctual thing of I don't like a sword being swung at me or a gun being shot at me, even if it's a BB. If someone's actually shooting at you, especially if you've been in a Dauntless or something and you've been chugging away over the featureless blue ocean for an
mhm.
hour or so, and then
Yeah.
all of a sudden everything's exploding, your
It can test.
recollection is
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, these events, they paint pictures on your mind, and the picture can be very, very vivid. But again, that picture can be disassociated in temporal space, and disassociated from the actions of other units that are doing their thing around
Mm.
you. It's fascinating stuff. Just trying to pull apart these first person accounts and try to make
Yeah.
sense of them.
Um, Another question. As you've seen, your appearances on military history shows like Battle 360 and Hell Below were both memorable and appreciated by many people. Is anything similar currently in the works for you?
Well, let's see here. Fox is just coming out with a new multi-part TV series on lost ships. So this is all of the archival footage that came out of Paul Allen's Vulcan Company expeditions that found Kaga and a number of other vessels. And so I did filming for that in February of this year, and it's just started to air this previous weekend. I haven't seen any
Mm-hmm.
of the episodes yet, but I think I'm on 5 or 6 of them.
Mm.
So, that's one thing to look for.
Mm.
Um, in terms of, well, doing this, which is always a great
Mm-hmm.
time. I did a panel discussion with Trent Hone and Craig Simons that I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned. That's going to be shipped by the World War II Museum on their website, I think on the 3rd, so this Friday.
Mm-hmm.
I got a couple other podcasts going. I'm doing one for Naval History Magazine on the 7th, and I'll be down in Texas in September at the Nimitz Museum.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually running a seminar on the year 1942, mostly on the Pacific side, but I'm going to be the lead-off speaker for that to
Mm.
try to create a larger context around the year 1942. But yeah, in terms of TV, I think that Fox special that's your next go-to.
Mm-hmm.
I am though still on Netflix, Greatest Battles in World War II in Color, and the follow-up one, which is Road to Victory. Um, I'm actually very pleased with that one because I
Mm-hmm.
managed to get on an episode that had to do with North Africa, which, for a guy who hasn't got a book out on North Africa
Mm-hmm.
yet,
Yes.
it was kind of fun to be on that episode.
Mm.
But I'm also on the episodes for Philippine Sea, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima. So if you got Netflix, you can
Mm-hmm.
you can find me there.
Cool. I'll have to have a look myself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are fun. Those are
Um,
really fun, actually. Yeah.
so someone's asking, would a carrier like Taiho how would a carrier like Taiho perform when put in a situation like a Kagi? Would she be able to shrug it off like Illustrious did, or would she still be in trouble? Would Taiho have sunk?
No, I think she shrugs it off. I mean, her deck could have handled. I'm pretty damn sure could have handled a 1,000 pound GP bomb. Yeah, I
Mm.
think I think the odds are, unless they manage to put it in the hangar when the elevator was in the down position or some freaky fluky hit like that. No, I think a carrier like Taiho, yeah, if they'd had
Mm.
Indomitable, that would have been a different kind of thing. The flip side being, of course, that you got a smaller air group to play with. So
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the thing because when you think the 1,000 pound bomb that made it through one of the armored carriers' flight decks was specifically a German armor piercing weapon, and even then it
right,
only just about detonated in the hangar. So yeah,
right,
GP bomb. Well, much like the GP bombs that and kamikazes are probably just detonated on impact with the
yeah,
flight deck.
yeah, I think that's right. And we know that there were not many aircraft on that flight deck. Maybe
Mm.
they got a fire, to put out on a 0 or 2, but that's a whole different can of worms than having to put out a fire that's inside your hangar. Um, I do think that I noticed that you had the armored carriers channel
Hmm.
on your page track, and that's a really interesting channel. It's a really interesting website as well. I think the Americans, we tend to sort of poo-poo um, Britain's carrier designs, and frankly, as a power projection asset, they were not as good as a carrier like the Essex class, not nearly.
Hmm.
But we don't give enough credence to the fact that the Mediterranean is a completely different threat environment to operate in. If you'd put any of the Yorktown class carriers, in the Med and had Flieger Corps 10 coming after them the way they did,
Hmm.
with Indomitable, I mean, yikes. Um, yeah, I don't know that they would have made it through that situation either.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's different ships for different situations, really.
right.
It's
Or is it Formidable? I can't remember which was the carrier that got zonked off of Malta by Flieger Corps 10.
I think that was illustrious. But
Was
then
it Lost?
to be
Okay.
honest, I think every armored carrier except for Victorious went in and took a heck of a pasting at one point in
Yeah.
or the other in the Med.
Right.
Um,
Thank you.
yeah, it's quite the fun activity when you're not having to be on the carrier.
Yeah,
Uh,
the Stuka was a very effective ship killing implement. You know, again, it was not necessarily a terribly invulnerable implement. It's interesting because you read a lot of the accounts from the British Army, places like Gazala, and they sort of poo-poo Stuka in an air support role, but they were no laughing matter to the warships that were out in the Med, and some of that I think too is driven by the fact that frankly British anti-aircraft fire was not necessarily on the same par with American, certainly
hmm,
not by mid to late war.
yeah, yeah. I've got a wonderful photo I took aboard USS Alabama, which I've decided I'm going to caption the late war U.S. Navy in a nutshell because it's a sort of a three-quarter view of the aft deck and it's literally just guns.
Jesus, right?
It's
Yeah,
like here's
guns, and not only guns, but guns with VT fusing, being radar directed by the Mark 37 director,
mm,
which was, I'm sorry, a superior system to the hacks.
mm,
So, I mean, the combination of all of those things
yeah,
put together made these just enormously powerful AA platforms.
yeah. I mean, apart from anything else, you want to sort of put hacks up against the Mark 37. I think the ultimate argument there is, well, when Vanguard was launched, the Royal Navy went to the US and said, "Can we have some Mark 37s, please? We're fine with the Admiralty Fire Control Table and Type 274 for the main guns, but when it
Yes,
comes to the AA, we're sticking Mark 37s on."
it tells you something. Yeah, a
Mm,
fully tachometric system is superior. Anyway, we're getting
yeah.
way
Anyway,
into
sorry.
side.
Um,
What do you got for me?
so, was a dawn bombardment of Midway to neutralise the airfield and any facilities possible by the Japanese heavy units sneaking up at night, or would they have been well spotted well before they could be in position?
Well, of course, that's exactly what Kurita's Cruiser Division 7 was attempting to do during the night of the 4th and the 5th. They were going to run that cruiser division in and try to pace the airfield and take it out of service. And only, I forget the exact time, 2 a.m. or something like that, they decided to pull the plug on that. Um, I don't have a lot of respect for Japanese um, gunfire support doctrine, I got to tell
Mm-hmm.
you. It just wasn't something in their kit bag that was terribly well developed. I do have a lot of respect for Mogami class heavy cruisers. They've plenty of gun power there, but without adequate spotting and a decent doctrine to back that up, I don't. Airfields are hard targets to knock out. A lot of people don't really understand, the regenerative power, frankly, of an airfield. Yeah, you can put some holes in the airfield, but somebody comes around with a steam shovel or whatever and fills those holes up, and you're back in business again. Um, and so I think that Yamamoto correctly diagnoses, that sending Crew Div 7 in against Midway unescorted is just a suicide mission. I'm going to lose all four of those ships, and so he turns them around. Yeah, I just don't see that being very efficacious. Certainly not given the fact that the Americans still had two operable carriers somewhere off to the northeast of Midway.
And, well, I guess that then leads on to how large was the effort in the aftermath of the battle to locate and find sailors from ships sunk in battle by both sides?
Great question. And actually, that rolls into something that we were talking about um, regarding the Battle of
Hmm.
Santa Cruz and Guadalcanal. So I want to tack that on in the end. You know, possession of the battlefield really is that's the main driving factor for whose side is going to be rescuing whose sailors and aviators. You know, the Japanese had to retreat, so not many of their guys that went in the water that weren't immediately close to a vessel were going to be pulled out. You know, the only instance that I can think of, frankly, again, is Chief Engineer Ayamune's um, engineering crew from Hiryu, which drift in a boat for 2 weeks and are on the brink of starvation um, when they are finally picked up by the submarine tender Ballard and brought in. And frankly, that's the first time that the Americans actually have confirmation that the Hiryu has sunk is when we capture that group of 27 or 28 guys. So the Americans were certainly very serious about trying to comb the ocean as much as they could because we knew that a number of our aviators had gone into the drink trying to make it back to the carriers after the dive bomber attack. And sadly, a number of them were never recovered. The Japanese, first of all, were a lot more lackadaisical about that kind of stuff, and they weren't in possession of the battlefield, so they didn't really make any sort of an effort.
Yeah, I
Oh,
must.
okay. So now let
Yeah.
me let me tack let me tack
Yep.
something on. So if you look at the Guadalcanal campaign, and this is one of the things that I find really interesting about just how attrition works in warfare. Um, throughout that campaign, you've got this constant drumbeat of air combat as the Japanese are dispatching bombers down from Rabaul, in many cases doing fighter sweeps along with them. Um, and so there's air combat over Henderson Field on a nearly daily basis throughout that time. The fact that the Americans were more serious about trying to put together an actual organized search and rescue operation so that we can pluck those fighter pilots out of the drink as much as possible, or get them in the hands of coast watchers where they can be picked up later on. You start looking at things like that, and then you factor in who's got the better medical care at Rabaul or Henderson, who's getting more food, uh, whose pilots are perhaps getting rotated on a little more frequent basis. Little things like that really start to add up. I mean, if you look at air encounters as being this sort of I've got this many planes on this side, this many planes on this side, and everybody gets to roll their dice, and what happens, happens. But then if I look at these little itty bitty factors, that I just laid out, and that changes, it means that suddenly the Americans are every combat, they're putting three or four more guys up in the air than they would have had otherwise if they didn't have better medical care, if they didn't have better search and rescue. And over the course of a multi-month campaign, a few extra dice here and there on a consistent day in, day out basis pay tremendous results in overall attrition of those two air organizations. And so I think what you see starting at Midway and going through the entire war is a concerted effort on the part of the Americans, again, to preserve their human capital. All of our pilots know if we go down and someone knows we've gone down and has seen us, our guys are going to do everything possible to get a plane or a submarine out there to look for us. And even from a morale perspective, that's a huge force multiplier as well,
Mm.
because it means that your guys go into combat a lot more confident than the Japanese do.
Yeah. Um, there we have. So Midway's always been portrayed that the Japanese battle plan A was that they invade Midway, then the Americans show up, they have a big fight, they win, and then the war is over. Was there any plan B? Like the Americans won't come out to fight. Well, then what? Do they just kind of sit around waiting there, or was it kind of plan A? This is what will happen, and therefore we don't need to plan for anything else.
Pretty much plan A. No, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things that makes the battle planning on the Japanese side kind of cockamamie, is that they really, it's all based on a view of what American morale is. And they think that our morale is pretty brittle at this point in the war, that, we've been hit in the face enough that, a few more good hard blows are going to convince us that, one, the Japanese aren't easily beatable, and two, we should be focusing the majority of our efforts against Germany, who, by the way, are shooting up our eastern seaboard and what have you. So that's kind of the calculus, and you see that then playing out in the operational planning as well. That we're going to parade some of these, invasion task forces with a couple of juicy, fast battleships, and that's going to be the bait to draw the Americans out, because of course they're a beaten force mentally and morally, and they're going to have to be lured out to battle because they won't want to come out otherwise. Which is, a fantastic misreading of the situation, because, of course, Nimitz, meanwhile, on the other side of the pond is just, chomping at the bit, waiting. He wants to get in there and bring the Japanese carrier force to battle and destroy it. The bottom line is that Japan's battle plan is driven by a faulty view of American morale. There really wasn't a plan B. They just assumed that it was going to play out the way that Yamamoto had scripted it.
And okay, given the issues the Americans were having with their torpedoes and their detonators at the time, even if somehow all the devastators survived, what would they actually have done to the Japanese carriers?
Good question. Of course, we don't know that we're having problems with our detonators on our torpedoes. We certainly didn't know that about our submarine torpedoes at this time. Although, as part of this article, I did run across a brief mention in the Gray Book from the May timeframe, where someone in there is like, our torpedoes don't seem to be working on our submarines as well as advertised. And you think about that, okay, so we've already gotten the clue in May of 42 that our submarine torpedoes are garbage. And yet it takes us until September of 43 until we actually get this problem figured out. That's criminal. Back to your point. A lot of people get hung up, I think, on the speed of the American airdrop torpedoes not being fast enough to overtake a Japanese carrier. Yeah, that's kind of a problem. But really, if you're attacking according to doctrine, you're going to be doing a hammer and anvil attack anyway, and the speed isn't really all that necessarily a huge variable in whether or not you're going to hit the target. The detonator, though, as you say, yeah, that's a real problem. Do we know of any successful American carrier torpedo attacks during the battle? I don't think we do. And frankly, okay, but then wind it back to Coral Sea. Did we hit Shoho with some airdrop torpedoes? Yeah, we sure did. So again, it's really hard to say. On any given day, those torpedoes, persnickety as they were, could potentially do some damage. Their odds weren't real good, though.
Now, believe it or not, we've actually run out of the pre-listed questions and the super chats, which is probably just as well, because it's 20 to midnight over here. You're probably still enjoying the glorious sun that disappeared hours ago.
Yeah. No, like I say, I was determined today to hang in with you to the bitter end.
Yeah.
I've nursed my suffering bastard to the bottom. So whatever you want.
So I guess we'll if we do maybe something like a half dozen more questions,
sure.
And then we'll wrap it up. And then I think otherwise this is going to be a nice long video anyway.
Yeah.
And we've covered a lot of ground. So if Amagi had not been damaged beyond repair, is it possible that the Japanese Navy would have developed more cross-deck capable doctrines with two identical carriers instead of two very different ones? So I guess this is when Amagi got totaled by the Great Kanto earthquake.
Yeah, yeah. I honestly, I don't think that affects the development of their doctrine all that much. I absolutely will grant you that Amagi would have been a more capable platform than Kaga was, certainly faster.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know that. I think if we look at the evolution of Japanese carrier air doctrine, it wasn't really governed by what's the speed of the platform necessarily.
Hmm.
Um, Kaga and Akagi were a perfectly compatible carrier division. I just don't think that was that big a factor.
Yeah. Um,
These are great questions, by the way.
yeah.
There have been a number that have been, I've never thought of these things before. They come out of an interesting left field. So, great
Hmm.
job. Yeah, that's been really fun.
Yeah. Um, what was the Japanese military ethos? Sorry, what was the impact of the Japanese military ethos on damage control, etc.? It seems that any officer, well, submarines or convoy defense intelligence, it seems that any officer with drive was pushed into offensive roles.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a very astute observation. This is a Navy that is warped, frankly, is reflexively focused on the offensive. The bottom line is if you're not doing something to sink enemy warships, you're not doing something that's worth doing. So that affects a lot of different aspects of their navy, and I think the questioner enumerated a number of them that are pertinent. Um, Offense always took precedence over defense. You see that then in the lethality of their anti-aircraft suites on their ships, which was not all that great. Um, they did not focus as much attention on anti-submarine actions. Although it's interesting, I know a couple of different individuals who are in the process of developing books on some of the early war operations of the Japanese. So if you look at the invasion of the Philippines and the desperate American attempts to try to beat off the Japanese invasion force at Lingayen Gulf off of Luzon. The reason we weren't able to do that is because the Japanese escorts there actually were performing very credible anti-submarine operations. So we in the West, I think, tend to paint them with too broad a brush and say that they were just incompetent. They didn't know what they were doing. And it's like actually they kind of did. And there were a number of other factors. Then, if you look at the late war situation, why does everything fall apart for the Japanese in ASW in 1944? It's not necessarily because their tactics were bad. It's because we're reading their operational codes. We finally figured out our own torpedo problems, and our submarines are operating in wolf packs now. There are a number of different, I hate to use the word synergistic, but there it is, a number of synergistic things that are all coming together in a very nice little package for the Americans that lead to the precipitous descent of Japanese naval shipping. Anyway, where were we? Yeah, the whole ethos of this Navy just sort of poo-pooed the defensive, and certainly with respect to damage control, it really bit them in the butt. If you look at American damage control, it became an all hands evolution. Everyone on a warship knew how to fight a fire. And the same was not true in the Japanese Navy. It was viewed as the province of specialists, primarily engineering specialists. And so if you've got a situation where, most of your engineering staff is below decks trapped in a burning engine room, you got a real problem. I think you can see too that if you're serious about damage control, you have to practice it. You have to have the right equipment. We only have to look a month prior at the loss of the Moskva
Mm-hmm.
to say that those navies that, pay lip service to damage control but aren't really interested in paying the freight in terms of training and equipment, this is not something you can improvise in combat. You
No.
have to live this and train this day in and day out.
Yeah, it's as you say, it's a body of evidence that's built up, and a lot of the time it's built up from experiences where things have gone horribly wrong.
Yes.
The CO2, CO2 in the fuel lines comes from someone watching Lexington go up in a fireball and going, I don't fancy that happening to me.
Yeah, no, that's
Hmm.
exactly right. That's
And
exactly right.
yeah,
Oscar Peterson, who was the fuel officer on Yorktown, he was like, I don't want that happening to my
mm,
ship. How do I figure it?
yeah,
But but it's again, you're absolutely correct, Track, that it's the lessons that are painful. And you think about what's going on with the war effort for the Allies in this first 6 months of this war, we are just getting crushed. We're getting toasted. It's embarrassing. And so what you're seeing on the American side of things is this frantic effort to evolve and improve and get
mm,
better. Um, Whereas the Japanese, our playbook seems to be working pretty well,
yeah.
and that's the kind of thing that gets you behind the power curve. And then, you couple that with the industrial power that the Americans can bring to bear on this problem. Once you're behind the power curve, say goodnight.
Yeah. One question is basically asking, could the Japanese have just gone all in with their surface fleet that was following up and just tried to go for Midway anyway in the aftermath of the battle?
There's an argument to be made for that. Um, I think if you look at a ship like Yamato, uh, yeah, that's an enormously difficult target to attack. And yes, the Americans had a lot of dive bombers left, but we don't have weapons that are going to go through the deck armor of Yamato. I'm here to tell you. You may be able to damage her topsides and make a mess out of her, but if you look at the damage that ultimately sank Musashi and Yamato, those were torpedoes. And right now, in the aftermath of that battle, no one on the American side wants to risk any more strikes by TBD devastators. It's a suicide march. We don't want that. So, I guess I go a little against the conventional wisdom and say that there's at least some credible evidence that you could have operated an armor heavy force in the neighborhood of Midway for some amount of time. The follow on question then becomes, to what end?
Mm.
Okay, great. I wake up in the morning and offshore are Nagato and Mutsu and Yamato. And again, they don't have a decent gunfire support doctrine. They pump some rounds into me. It sucks. But I've got 4,000 Marines on this atoll. And you've brought a landing force of around 2,500 or so. And I'm surrounded by a reef, and you can't get across it, and you don't have enough automatic weapons, and my beaches are strewn with mines. I've got automatic weapons out the yin yang. I just don't think they can take the place away from us, whether or not they can operate battleships there or not. I just don't see that as relevant. And I think some of that also informs Yamamoto's decision to break off the operation. I mean, there's this old saying, right? You're a fool to fight a ship against a fort. And that goes all the way back to Nelson's times. And I think they're largely in the same situation, that you open yourself up to taking damage and you're not likely to come out with any sort of commensurate returns.
And then we've got, what's I put it here? This is probably going a little bit further back. Did the US learn more in terms of naval combat from their pre-war exercises and war plans, or during the course of the war?
That's a fascinating question. And so now I want to tip my hat to Trent Hone on this and say, if you really want to delve into that, his book, Learning War, and certainly his forthcoming Nimitz book will address both of these issues. I think Trent's answer to this question would be that the question really revolves more around, did the U.S. Navy create a culture of learning? where it could assimilate those lessons and do it on a rapid basis. That really the largest achievement that the US Navy made before the war was not necessarily the creation of doctrine or things like War Plan Orange. It was the creation of an organization that was extremely adaptable and was able to effectively bubble up good ideas from the lower level units, and provide a framework wherein it was okay to experiment. That if you're a squadron commander, a guy like Moosebrugger, or Arleigh Burke, that it's cool, to train your little unit of 3 or 4 ships in the doctrine that you think is going to work for your particular tactical circumstances. And if it turns out to be, unsuccessful, that's okay. We learned things. That's what we wanted you to do. If it turns out to be successful, we have the mechanisms whereby we can promulgate that knowledge rapidly throughout other units like yours, and then it becomes a part of their playbook as well. That is something that the US Navy did superlatively well during the war. It actually starts to taper off towards the end. The reason being that now the Navy has become so large that there has to be more in the way of stock doctrine that is being taught to these new incoming officers. The pre-war Navy in a lot of ways was small enough that a lot of these guys, everybody knew everybody else, right? And so you knew who the good operators were and the good tacticians were. Fast forward to the point where we've got this 2,000 ship Navy with 3 million guys in it. All of a sudden, now you have to have a little bit more of a cookie cutter approach to your doctrinal problems. But anyway, I'm belaboring the point. We were really good at learning.
Yeah, I mean, when I read Learning War, and obviously then had Trent on to talk about it in 2 parts, I think that was the thing that I came away from it. Weirdly enough, in some ways, matches what I learned the most when I was in the US looking at the various museum ships in April, which was the US was really obsessed with removing single points of failure, both in their ships and in their organization. So you could have a fleet problem where Admiral King, basically does Pearl Harbor 10 years before Pearl Harbor. Right. And sure, you can have a few people high up in the US Navy top brass who go, yeah, we're just going to ignore that and pretend it never happened. And then Pearl Harbor happens. But then in some navies, it would happen. And then everyone would be like, oh, now what?
Right.
Even if they'd been warned. Whereas in something like the US Navy, even if the top brass ignored it at the time, and then obviously Pearl Harbor happens, everybody else from in the lower ranks down was able to go, what do we do to not have that happen again?
Yes.
And then gets listened to, as opposed to, how dare you without more gold on your uniform than any other material? How dare you speak up? I'm going to beat you with sticks until you go away. Right. Yeah. Again, the whole bubble up kind of mechanism is really important. This plays into a larger issue too. Sometimes in these hypothetical questions, one of the guys that I just go after constantly, who I really dislike, is Richmond Kelly Turner. Just can't stand the guy. And largely that's true. That is because he ends up besmirching Fletcher's reputation, which I take umbrage with. But Turner was much the better bureaucratic fighter, and against a guy like, Fletcher, who was no good at self-promotion, of course he was going to win. And when I floated that opinion, this is one of the rare instances when Jim Hornfisher and I disagreed on something. This was during a panel discussion down at the World War II Museum. He was like, Turner is indispensable to the American war effort in the Pacific. And I said, no. If you believe that, then you don't understand the nature of this war. This was a war of systems, okay? There were no indispensable people in this war. Or if there were maybe 4 or 5. I mean, you can look at, cats like, Churchill or Stalin or, maybe Zhukov, maybe. But honest to God, the number of truly indispensable people in this war are numbered on your hands. And Richmond Kelly Turner is not one of them, okay?
if the U.S. Navy, if Richard Kelly Turner got vaporized and blown into space one morning, there is somebody else out there in this organization, in this learning organization, that is going to have the ability to step into that dude's shoes and perform that role. Maybe not, with 100% of Turner's brilliance, but in a war like this, 95% will get it done. So, anyway,
Yeah.
off my soapbox.
That's all right. So I guess if we'll wrap up the stream now with one last question, which is an amusing one, at least from my perspective. It says, funny question if you're interested. If during Midway, Admiral Kondo had a similar habit to Admiral Zinovy Rozhesvensky, apologies to any people who actually know how that admiral's pronounced from the Battle of Tsushima, how many binoculars would he need based on the historical results of Midway? This is referencing Rozhesvensky's habit of just hurling binoculars over the side of the ship in fury when something went horribly wrong.
That's a really interesting question. Kondo was placed in command of the battle briefly. They relieved Nagumo in the middle of the battle, and Kondo is now the man. I don't know. I have no idea how to even answer that. All I would say is that, certainly Kondo was, coming gunning for any American surface forces and carrier forces that he could get his sights on. The Japanese intended to fight a night battle that night. And it is to Spruance's credit that he very wisely decided to hold his carrier forces at arm's length. That's been one of the classic counterfactuals. What if Halsey had been at Midway? But I think, and a lot of people say, and Nimitz quipped after the war, oh my God, it would have been terrible if Halsey had been there, because he was so aggressive that he likely would have been moving his carrier forces to the west and then potentially run into Kondo's surface forces that night. I think that there's a two-part answer to that, though. If Halsey had been there that morning, I bet you that Mitcher would not have disobeyed Halsey's orders to send his air groups where Halsey wanted them to, by God, go. And if you posit that, and then you take Bonger's and Torres' stochastic model, at face value, again, this battle is over 4-zip by lunchtime, and we win. And there is no night battle to be worried about. So, maybe having Halsey in that case would not have been as disastrous as some people might have said, because the battle would have been so clearly over that the Japanese wouldn't have even tried to salvage it that night. I don't know. That's my wild counterfactual.
Yeah, I must say, I hope a balanced opinion on Halsey, in my opinion, is that Halsey was exactly the admiral the U.S. Navy needed up to about the end of 1943.
That's you got it right on the money. That same panel discussion that Jim Hornfisher and I did, this was back in 2018 or so. We were doing best admirals in the U.S. Navy and worst admirals, and Halsey made both of my lists. For precisely that reason. You look at his performance in 1942, and it's brilliant. And one of the things that is so underappreciated about Halsey, I think, is his ability to act jointly. He's got this horribly screwed up logistical situation in Noumea, which is the main harbor in New Caledonia. They've got like 60 different cargo vessels that are unloaded, and they need this stuff on Guadalcanal because things are on a knife's edge right now. Who does he turn to? An Army logistics general. He's just like, figure this out, man. Make this happen. He was able to get along with MacArthur. He made the whole, operational joint air group, in Solomons be a joint command with rotating commanders through the Marines, the Navy, the Army Air Corps. He was brilliant at that kind of stuff. And, of course, he brought the necessary aggressiveness to the Guadalcanal campaign that Gormley did not have. But, yeah, you fast forward to 1944, and now the war is again, this is really a war centered on organization and staff work. You know, the machine just needs to do its thing. And if you look at who can run that kind of a machine better, Halsey or Spruance, hands down Spruance.
Yeah. So with that, everyone, you've enjoyed basically a free 3 hour lecture from from John Parshall, which is not something that many people can say. And since it's literally just gone 1 minute past midnight in the
Good
UK,
night.
we're going to bid you all adieu. Thanks very much for
Sure
all the
had this
questions.
fun.
Obviously, we couldn't get to all of them, but to be honest, given how many questions there are,
We never would.
yeah, I mean, it gives us something to do next year because, yeah,
There you go.
otherwise we'd be here for 24 hours until one of us
Right.
passes out. So,
Yeah.
see you all later, everyone, and have a good day, night, or whatever time of the time it is. Bye.
Thanks so much.
There we go.